Welcome to my channel, Crimson Inquiry.
Of all the queer cases that have come under my observation in the companionship of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, there can be few stranger than that which I am about to recount, a matter so steeped in the mists of family secrecy and the chill of ancestral grudge that it seemed, at first glance, to defy the very laws of reason. It was the sort of affair that would have sent the average man scurrying to the nearest vicar for solace in the supernatural. Yet Holmes, with his unerring eye for the improbable made probable, discerned in it a web of human cunning as intricate as any spider's lace. The events transpired in the autumn of 1892, during one of those damp London seasons when the fog clung to the Thames like a shroud, and the gas lamps flickered like dying stars against the encroaching gloom. The crime itself broke upon the city with the suddenness of a thunderclap, though it was whispered of in drawing-rooms long before the constables arrived. Lady Eleanor Hargrove, matriarch of the venerable Hargrove lineage and widow to Sir Reginald Hargrove, the eminent collector of Renaissance curiosities, was discovered one chill morning in her private gallery at Hargrove Hall, a sprawling edifice on the outskirts of Kensington. She lay sprawled before a towering gilt-framed portrait, her arthritic fingers still clutching at the hem of her velvet gown, her face frozen in an expression of uncomprehending horror. The cause of death, as the police surgeon later pronounced with that clinical detachment which so often masks the macabre, was a swift and subtle poison, arsenic, administered in her evening cocoa not 2 hours before her body was found by the housemaid at dawn. But it was not the manner of her passing that baffled Scotland Yard, nor even the absence of any sign of forced entry into the heavily secured gallery, with its iron-barred windows and oaken door bolted from within. No, the true enigma lay in the portrait itself, that brooding likeness of Lady Eleanor's long-deceased grandmother, the formidable Mrs. Beatrice Worthing, who had shuffled off this mortal coil some 40 years prior, in the very same chamber. The painting, an oil on canvas executed by a forgotten journeyman artist in the florid style of the Regency, had hung in that precise spot since the old woman's death, a silent sentinel over generations of Hargrove's secrets. It depicted Mrs. Worthing in her prime, seated in a high-backed chair with a lace cap framing her severe countenance, her hands folded demurely over a leather-bound ledger that bespoke her reputed shrewdness in matters of estate. What rendered the scene unspeakable was the alteration to the portrait. Overnight, as if by some devilish sleight of hand, the ledger in Mrs. Worthing's grasp had been replaced in the painting with a crumpled missive, a letter, clearly visible in the flickering candlelight that had illuminated Lady Eleanor's final moments. The paper bore the unmistakable watermark of Hargrove stationery, and scrawled across it in a hand that mimicked the late matriarch's own spidery script were the words, "The blood of the innocent cries out." The air is false. Below this accusation, in a flourish of crimson pigment that seemed almost to drip like fresh spilled gore, was appended a signature, Beatrice Worthing, resurrected in truth. The implications were as thunderous as they were inexplicable. Mrs. Worthing had been dust for decades. Her portrait, authenticated by experts and guarded with the zeal of a family talisman, had not stirred from its hooks since the day it was hung. Yet here it stood, defaced in a manner that suggested not mere vandalism, but a posthumous indictment from the grave. Whispers rippled through the household like ripples on a poisoned pond. Was it the work of a medium spirit, a curse from the old woman's unquiet soul, roused by some fresh familial perfidy? The servant spoke in hushed tones of rappings in the night, and shadows flitting across the gallery walls, while the family itself, those few who remained, huddled in the drawing-room, their faces as pale as the marble busts lining the halls. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, that terrier of a man with his sharp nose for the obvious, arrived post-haste, summoned by a frantic telegram from young Mr. Percival Hargrove, Lady Eleanor's nephew, and the presumptive heir to the estate. Lestrade poked and prodded at the scene with the enthusiasm of a terrier unearthing a bone, his brow furrowed beneath his bowler hat. "A locked-room poison, eh?" he muttered to his sergeant, a burly fellow named Hargreaves. "And this daubery on the canvas, looks like the work of some cracked-brained artist with a grudge. We'll have the lot of 'em down to the yard. Nephew, butler, the lot. Motives plain as day. That letter's pointing straight at the inheritance, mark my words. The family, a motley assembly of Hargrove remnants, provided little to illuminate the gloom. Percival Hargrove, a sleek young barrister of 30 summers, with a moustache waxed to points and eyes that darted like minnows, professed shock and indignation. Aunt Eleanor was the soul of the house, he declared, his voice quivering with what might have been genuine grief or rehearsed eloquence. And Grandmother Worthing, a saint in her time though stern, this blasphemy must be the act of an outsider, some vagrant who scaled the walls. The gallery lock was rusted. You see, never used it much. His cousin, Miss Lydia Hargrove, a spinster of indeterminate years who favoured bombazine gowns and brooches heavy with garnets, wrung her hands until they blanched. "Oh, the poor dear," she wailed, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "But that letter, it speaks of the heir being false. Percival, what could it mean? You who have always been the apple of Aunt Eleanor's eye." Her gaze lingered on him a fraction too long, laced with something sharper than sorrow, envy perhaps, or the bitterness of one passed over in the will. Then there was Mr. Josiah Finch, the family solicitor, a dry-as-dust gentleman, with spectacles perched on a beak of a nose and a ledger perpetually under his arm. He had been closeted with Lady Eleanor the evening prior, poring over estate papers by the very same gaslight that now cast elongated shadows across the gallery floor. "I left her at 10:30, he stated flatly, his voice like the rustle of legal parchments. She seemed in good spirits, though preoccupied with the portrait. Mentioned something about old ghosts stirring. But poison, forgery? I assure you, gentlemen, my firm has handled the Hargrove affairs for 3 generations without a whiff of scandal." The butler, a stoic relic named Wilkins, who had served the family since the days of the Crimean War, offered only a bow and a murmur. "Her ladyship took her cocoa as usual, sir, prepared by my own hand. No visitors after Mr. Finch departed." His eyes, however, betrayed a flicker, regret, knowledge withheld. Lestrade, ever the bulldog, snapped at him like a constable at a poacher, but the man yielded nothing more. By midday the fog had thickened to a pea-souper, blanketing Hargrove Hall in an impenetrable pall that mirrored the opacity of the case. Telegrams flew to the yard, and the press, those vultures of Fleet Street, hovered at the gates scenting a tale of spectral vengeance. Lestrade wired Holmes that evening, his message terse with frustration. Locked gallery. Poisoned lady. Portrait tampered. Dead granny accuses heir. Family tight-lipped. Need your eye, Holmes. Hargrove Hall, tomorrow a.m. It was thus that my friend and I found ourselves summoned to the fray. I had been attending to my practice in Baker Street, dosing a bronchial cabinet minister with tinctures of digitalis, when Mrs. Hudson rapped upon my door with the telegram in her apron pocket. Holmes, lounging in his armchair with a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his lip and the Stradivarius idle across his knee, perused the flimsy with a languid arch of his brow. "The dead accusing the living, Watson," he remarked, his grey eyes alight with that predatory gleam I knew so well. How delightfully absurd. And yet, in the annals of crime, the grave has often been made to whisper secrets the living dare not utter. A forgery, you say? Or something more ingenious? I confess, as we rattled southward in a hansom cab through the swirling mists, my mind reeled at the possibilities. Arsenic in cocoa, child's play for the determined poisoner, yet the locked door precluded an intruder. The portrait's alteration suggested an artist at work under cover of night. But how? And the message itself. The heir is false. It smacked of buried scandal, perhaps a bastardy or a forged will lurking in the family vaults. Holmes, however, seemed unperturbed, his long fingers steepled as he gazed out at the gaslit phantoms of London. To pass the time, he turned to me with one of those sudden digressions that so often prefaced his deeper cogitations. "Observe." "Watson," said he as our cab drew level with the disreputable pawnbrokers on the Edgware Road, "that fellow there, the one with the frayed cuffs and the bulge in his right coat pocket. A violinist down on his luck, I'll wager, pawning his bow for a few shillings to stave off the landlord. Note the calluses on his fingers, the rosin dust on his trousers. But mark the hesitation in his step. He'll haggle fiercely, yet reclaim it by week's end when the orchestras call him back." I peered through the gloom, squinting at the shadowy figure. "By Jove, Holmes, you're right. But how—" "Deduction, my dear fellow," he replied with a thin smile, leaning back as the cab lurched onward. "The world is an open book to those who bother to read it. And this case at Hargrove Hall? It promises chapters yet unwritten, chapters of ink and pigment, of grudges gilded in gold leaf. The dead grandmother, you see, cannot speak, but her portrait might, if we but listened to its silences. Little did I suspect, as the cab wheels crunched to a halt before the looming facade of Hargrove Hall, that those silences would echo with revelations to chill the marrow. The game, as Holmes would term it, was afoot, and in the shadowed gallery beyond, the first moves had already been played. We alighted from the hansom amid the swirling eddies of fog that seemed to seep from the very pores of Hargrove Hall, its Georgian facade looming like a stern judge beneath the pallid sky. The gravel crunched underfoot as we approached the portico, where a footman, pale and perspiring despite the chill, hastened to admit us. His livery hung loose on his frame, as if grief had already winnowed him down, and he stammered apologies for the disarray within, his eyes flicking nervously toward the shadowed interior. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, sir," he announced to the empty hall, his voice echoing off the panelled walls adorned with ancestral portraits that glared down with painted disapproval. From the drawing-room beyond, there came a rustle of voices, and Inspector Lestrade emerged, his ferret-like features twisted in a grimace of relief and irritation. He gripped Holmes's hand with the fervour of a drowning man clutching a spar, his other hand clutching a dog-eared notebook. "Ah, Holmes, thank the stars you've come. This one's a proper stinker. Locked room, poison, and now this ghostly scribble on the canvas. The yard's got half the family in a flutter, and the nephew's lawyering up already. Percival Hargrove, slippery as an eel, that one. Come, the gallery's this way. I've kept it sealed since dawn." Holmes inclined his head with that economical grace of his hawk-like gaze sweeping the vestibule as we followed Lestrade down a corridor lined with suits of armour, their visors eternally lowered in mute vigil. "The particulars, Inspector," said he, his voice a silken thread amid the creak of floorboards. "Spare me the telegraphic brevity. I require the full tapestry, lest the pattern elude us." Lestrade, puffing slightly from the haste, obliged as we turned into the gallery, a long chamber of polished oak and vaulted ceiling, where the air hung heavy with the scent of beeswax and aged oil paint. Sunlight filtered weakly through the barred casements, casting latticed shadows across the parquet floor, and there in the centre reposed the shrouded form of Lady Eleanor beneath a sheet, flanked by a pair of constables who stood at attention like mismatched bookends. The portrait dominated the far wall, its gilt frame gleaming mockingly, the altered ledger now a garish anachronism in Mrs. Worthing's rigid grasp. The old lady, Lady Eleanor, that is, was found at 6:15 by the housemaid Elsie who brings up the morning tea. Door bolted from inside, window secure, no signs of a struggle. Cocoa cup on the side table, half drunk and the dregs test positive for arsenic. Enough to fell a horse, says the surgeon. Wilkins the butler swears he brewed it himself at 10 o'clock after Mr. Finch the solicitor left. No one in or out after that. And the painting, Lestrade gestured with his notebook, his face souring. It was fine yesterday, ledger and all, per the staff. This morning, that letter bold as brass. Artists' work, no doubt. Pigment still tacky in places. But who? And why lock themselves in to do it? I had drawn closer to the body, steeling myself against the familiar pang of professional curiosity mingled with sorrow, and lifted the sheet with gentle respect. Lady Eleanor's features, once no doubt imperious in life, were slackened in death, her lips tinged blue, her eyes half-lidded in perpetual surprise. The gown, a rich burgundy silk, bore faint creases at the elbows, as if she had risen abruptly from her chair. "Rigour has set in unevenly," I murmured, palpating the limbs. "Death between midnight and 2, I'd estimate. No external wounds, save the pallor suggesting rapid toxicity." Holmes, who had been circling the room with the abstracted air of a mathematician pondering a theorem, paused before the portrait, his fingertips hovering inches from the canvas without touching. His eyes, those twin augers of truth, narrowed as he absorbed the scene. The severe face of Mrs. Worthing, her lace cap askew in the artist's flourish, the crimson script bleeding into the folds of her painted skirt. "The air is false," he echoed softly, as if tasting the words. "A posthumous verdict delivered with theatrical flair, and yet, Inspector, you posit an intruder. with the door bolted and the windows barred like a debtor's prison. Lestrade snorted, rubbing his chin. Aye, that's the rub. Unless it's one of the family, nephew perhaps with a key, or the butler slipping in like a shadow. Motives there, plain enough. The will reads tomorrow and Percival stands to inherit the lot, estate collections the lot. But that message... It's like the old biddy herself crawled out of her tomb to point the finger. At that juncture, the door creaked open once more, admitting young Percival Hargrove. His barrister's poise somewhat rumpled by the night's ordeal. He was a dapper figure, attired in a dove-grey suit that accentuated his slender build, though the shadows beneath his eyes betrayed a sleepless vigil. "Mr. Holmes," he said, extending a hand with practiced smoothness, "your reputation precedes you. Aunt Eleanor would have insisted upon your involvement had she... Well, the inspector here has been most thorough, but I fear the household is in tatters. My cousin Lydia is prostrate with nerves, and Mr. Finch—" "Quite," interjected Holmes, turning from the portrait with a fluid motion that belied his intensity. His gaze alighted upon Percival's cuff, where a speck of ochre dust clung like an accusation. "Mr. Hargrove, if I may, your occupation keeps you much in the courts, I perceive. Chancery Lane, perhaps? The ink stains on your sleeve suggest recent perusal of dusty precedents." Percival blinked, glancing at his arm as if the mark were a personal affront. "Why, yes, barrister at the Inner Temple. But how—" "A trifle," Holmes replied, waving it aside with a thin smile. "The weave of your woolen sock betrays the damp of the embankment walks, and the faint scent of vellum clings to you like a second skin. But observe, Watson," he continued, turning to me with that sudden pivot that so often illuminated his method. "Mr. Hargrove's tie-pin, note the hallmark. A discreet crest of the Oxford Union. A relic from university days, yet the enamel is chipped at the edge, as from frequent consultation in moments of deliberation. It speaks to a man who values tradition, yet bends it when necessity demands." I leaned in, squinting at the pin, a silver fox's head indeed worn at the muzzle. "Extraordinary," I said, though not for the first time in Holmes's company. Percival coloured slightly, adjusting his cravat with a nervous tug. "You are too kind, sir," he murmured, "though I fear such deductions offer little light on our present darkness. That vile scrawl, the air is false. It wounds me, Mr. Holmes. Grandmother Worthing was a pillar of rectitude. To invoke her thus is sacrilege." Holmes's expression remained impassive, though I detected the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, a sign to me that the gears of his mind were whirring. "Sacrilege often masks strategy, Mr. Hargrove. Tell me, if you will, when last did you view this portrait intact?" "Yesterday afternoon," Percival replied promptly, his eyes steady. "Aunt Eleanor had me fetch a volume from the library adjoining, something on Venetian glass for her collection. I passed through then. The ledger was as ever. She seemed distant, though. Mused aloud about echoes from the past as I left. Lestrade cleared his throat, flipping open his notebook. "And you, sir?" "Alone with her ladyship after Mr. Finch departed." "Merely to bid good night," Percival affirmed. "She retired early, cocoa in hand. Wilkins can attest." At the mention, the butler materialized in the doorway like a well-oiled ghost, bearing a tray with glasses of sherry, his idea of fortification, no doubt. Wilkins was a man carved from oak, his face a map of Service's quiet campaigns, from the Crimea to this domestic siege. He poured with steady hands, but I noted the tremor in his voice as he spoke. "Indeed, sir. Her ladyship took the tray at 10:30 sharp. I locked the outer doors and retired to my pantry. Heard nothing amiss till Elsie's scream at dawn." Holmes accepted a glass, though he scarcely sipped, his attention drifting to the side table where the cocoa cup sat, its porcelain lip stained with residue. He bent low, inhaling subtly, then straightened with a murmur. "White arsenic, I fancy. Odourless save for a faint garlic tang on the breath which the surgeon no doubt noted. But the cup, porcelain from Sèvres if I'm not mistaken, with a hairline fracture at the base. Curious that it did not shatter in the fall." Lestrade grunted approval. "Sharp eye, Holmes. The fracture's old, per the maid. Her ladyship was clumsy in her latter years." "Clumsy," Holmes echoed, his tone neutral, "or perhaps persistent. Watson, your medical eye. Would such a vessel retain traces of prior bruise?" I examined it closely. The fracture a silvery vein, possibly if not scoured thoroughly. But arsenic accumulates so precisely. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A vessel weakened, like a trust eroded over time. And now, gentlemen, if we might proceed undisturbed. The gallery holds its own confessions, I suspect. As Lestrade and Percival withdrew to the drawing-room, muttering of statements and searches, Holmes and I were left to the chamber's solemn hush. He moved with purposeful languor, magnifying glass in hand, tracing the portrait's edges where the alteration met the original canvas. The crimson pigment, fresh and glossy, had been applied with a fine camel hair brush. The letters formed in a hand that aped the antique, but betrayed modern haste. A slight thickening at the F in false, perhaps from a left-handed stroke. "See here, Watson," he said softly, indicating a flake of gesso at the frame's lower corner, dislodged as if by recent pressure. Not the work of a ghost, but of flesh and bone. And yet the choice of medium, oil over oil, blended seamlessly. Our forger is no amateur, an artist or one versed in restoration. I nodded, jotting notes in my pocketbook, the chill of the room seeping into my bones. The fog pressed against the windows like inquisitive fingers, and from the corridor came the muffled sob of Miss Lydia, a counterpoint to the ticking long-case clock. Holmes paused at the bolted door, testing the iron mechanism with a gloved finger. Locked from within, yet the key remains in the lock, untouched per Lestrade. No spare found on the body. A conundrum, eh? Unless... His words trailed into silence, his mind evidently leaping ahead to connections yet invisible to me. I felt that familiar thrill, the cusp of revelation, where the mundane fractured into the profound. But as he turned to the library door, ajar in the adjoining wall, a faint scuff mark caught my eye on the threshold, a smear of ochre, mirroring the dust on Percival's cuff. "Holmes," I began, but he forestalled me with a raised hand, his expression one of quiet exhilaration. "Patience, my dear Watson. The peculiarities multiply as they must. Let us consult the volumes her ladyship favoured last. Echoes, after all, are but sounds reflected." And so, as the afternoon waned into a premature twilight, we delved deeper into the gallery's secrets, each clue a thread in the unravelling tapestry of deceit. Little did I dream how those threads would lead us through shadowed motives and forged legacies, binding the living to the long-buried dead. The library adjoining the gallery proved a sanctum of scholarly retreat, its walls groaning under the weight of leather-bound folios and curios from Sir Reginald's eclectic hoard, Venetian glassware glinting like captured stars on mahogany shelves, alongside folios of illuminated manuscripts that whispered of bygone illuminators. A fire crackled fitfully in the grate, doing little to dispel the encroaching chill, and the air carried the musty perfume of aged paper, mingled with a sharper note, almost acrid, that set my nostrils twitching. Holmes, ever the alchemist in such environs, moved with the precision of a surgeon dissecting a cadaver, his long fingers trailing lightly over the spines, as if coaxing confessions from the volumes themselves. "Venetian glass, you say, Watson?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble that blended with the pop of sapwood in the flames. Percival mentioned a tome on the subject. Here it is. He extracted a ponderous volume from a lower shelf, its cover embossed with gilt tracery depicting Murano's famed filigree. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as he leafed through, pausing at a marked page where an engraving illustrated a chalice of intricate lattice work, its facets catching the light in prismatic defiance of solidity. Lady Eleanor was consulting this last per her nephew. Note the marginalia, her hand, I presume, with that distinctive loop on the E that matches the correspondence in the gallery desk. I peered over his shoulder, my pencil hovering above my notebook, the lead smudging slightly in the damp. The notation was faint, inked in sepia. CF, the false gleam, shadows within the crystal. Curious phrasing, I observed, as if she suspected some counterfeit in the collection. But how does it bear on the portrait, Holmes? Or the poison? He closed the book with a soft thud, replacing it precisely, his eyes distant as if pursuing an invisible quarry through the labyrinth of his thoughts. Everything bears, Watson, every mote, every marginal scrawl. The portrait's alteration is no random daub. It echoes this very suspicion of falsity. The air is false, a phrase that resonates like a cracked bell. But come, the desk yonder may yield more. The library desk, a partner's bureau of rosewood inlaid with ivory, stood in the alcove nearest the gallery door. Its surface a battlefield of scattered papers, estate ledgers, a half-finished letter to a Parisian dealer in antiquities, and a silver inkstand with quill still poised, as if Lady Eleanor had but stepped away for a moment's repose. Holmes seated himself in the throne-like chair, drawing the lamp closer, its green shade casting his features in verdant relief, a goblin king pondering his realm. I stood sentinel by the threshold, noting the scuff mark anew, that ochre smear now joined by a companion fleck on the carpet's fringe, as if a boot had dragged in haste. "Observe the ink levels," Holmes said, tilting the stand to catch the light. "The well is low, recent use and not for mere correspondence. The quill's nib is splayed as from pressure on thick vellum." He selected a sheet from the blotter, holding it to the flame's edge until the indentations bloomed like frost on a window pane. "Bequest to P.H. contested. B.W.'s ledger reveals..." The script trails off, but the intent is plain. Beatrice Worthing's ledger, the very prop in the portrait, holds some damning entry. Lady Eleanor was drafting a codicil, it seems, to challenge the heirship. My pulse quickened at the revelation, the pieces slotting with a grind that promised more friction ahead. Then the message on the canvas. It's a forgery meant to preempt her, to sway the family or the solicitor before the will's read. But who knew of this? Finch was with her last, closeted over papers. "Precisely," Holmes replied, his tone laced with that dry amusement that signaled a fresh inference. "And yet the blotter shows no arsenic residue, nor on the cup beyond the dregs. The poison was introduced elsewhere, perhaps in the pantry, or..." He rose abruptly, crossing to the gallery door and kneeling to examine the bolt. The mechanism was a sturdy Mortimer's patent, its keyhole scarred from years of use, but the bolt itself slid with oiled smoothness. No fresh scratches. Locked from within, as Lestrade insists. Yet the air in here, do you not detect it, Watson? That faint undercurrent, like almonds crushed underfoot. I inhaled deeply, the scent now unmistakable amid the library's must, a bitter chemical tang that no Victorian nose could mistake. Cyanide? But the surgeon pronounced arsenic. A red herring, my dear fellow, or a layered deception. The cocoa's garlic reek masks subtler poisons, but this whiff clings to the hinges, as if volatilized in the lock's crevice. He produced a slender probe from his waistcoat, a tool of his own devising. I suspected and gently teased at the keyhole, withdrawing a flake of crystalline residue on its tip. Prussic acid distilled to vapor. Inhaled, it kills swiftly, but here, a diversion perhaps to suggest an alternative vector. Clever if crude. As he spoke, a shadow fell across the threshold, Miss Lydia Hargrove, her bombazine rustling like autumn leaves in a gale. She clutched a vinaigrette to her nose, her garnet brooch winking like a baleful eye, and her cheeks bore the flush of one who had wept copiously, yet found no solace. "Gentlemen," she quavered, her voice a fragile trill, "forgive the intrusion. The inspector bids you join us in the drawing-room. Mr. Finch has arrived with the documents, and Percival is quite beside himself. He insists the servants be questioned en masse. Oh, it is all too dreadful. The gallery with Mother's portrait so profaned. Grandmother Worthing would turn in her grave." Holmes straightened, pocketing the probe with a fluid motion, his expression softening to that rare veneer of empathy he reserved for the genuinely afflicted. "Miss Hargrove, your distress is understandable. The portrait, your grandmother's likeness, holds deep sentimental weight, I collect. Did Lady Eleanor often speak of it in latter days? Any unease regarding its vigil?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the canvas as if it might animate under scrutiny, then nodded faintly. Aunt Eleanor grew peculiar about it these past months. After grandfather's catalogues were unearthed in the attic, those inventories of his collections, she would sit for hours, staring at the ledger in grandmother's hands. "It knows," she would say, half to herself. "The false ones cannot hide forever. I thought it the rheumatism speaking or the loneliness, but now..." Her voice fractured and she pressed the vinaigrette closer. "The false ones," Holmes echoed, his gaze sharpening like a lens focused on infinity. "A family law, perhaps? Your grandmother, Mrs. Worthing, did she oversee the estates with particular rigor?" Lydia's lips thinned, a flicker of old resentments animating her pallor. "Rigor? She was iron, Mr. Holmes, ruled the Hargroves with that very ledger, tallying every shilling, every secret. Father, Uncle Reginald, said she once exposed a cousin's embezzlement, stripping him of his portion. But that was ages ago. The ledger vanished with her, or so we thought, until Aunt Eleanor found a duplicate in the vaults last spring. It caused quite the stir, entries about contested births, shadowed adoptions. Percival laughed it off, of course, but Aunt... She brooded. I jotted furiously, the pencil's scratch a counterpoint to the fire's dying sputter. Contested births, the air is false. The threads tightened, coiling toward a nexus of illegitimacy, perhaps, or a bastard line clawing at legitimacy. Yet Holmes's face betrayed no triumph, only that coiled intensity, like a greyhound scenting the hare. "Your candour is appreciated, Miss Hargrove," he said, offering his arm with courtly grace. "Lead on to the drawing-room, if you will. These documents of Mr. Finch's may illuminate the gloom." The drawing-room, a chamber of faded opulence with chintz settees and a Persian rug, worn to threads by generations of pacing Hargroves, buzzed with subdued tension as we entered. Lestrade hunched over a low table, his notebook splayed amid teacups and a decanter of brandy, while Percival prowled the hearth, his moustache twitching like a divining rod. Mr. Josiah Finch, the solicitor, perched ramrod on a spindle chair, his ledger open like a talisman against the chaos, spectacles glinting as he adjusted them with ink-stained fingers. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," Finch intoned, his voice a parchment rustle, rising to clasp hands, a fortuitous arrival. "Her ladyship's will is set for probate tomorrow, but this outrage necessitates precautions. I've brought the preliminary drafts, the bequest to Percival, the endowments for Lydia's charities. Nothing amiss, I assure you, save a vague clause about reviewing ancestral claims. Lady Eleanor was most insistent on that point last evening." Holmes accepted a chair, his posture deceptively relaxed, though I knew the machinery within whirred at fever pitch. "The ancestral claims, tied to Mrs. Worthing's ledger, no doubt. Might we peruse that clause, Mr. Finch? Discretion, of course, but clarity serves justice." Finch demurred with a lawyer's finesse, sliding the document across. "A mere formality. In light of revelations from the Worthing Codex, the heirship to be scrutinized post-mortem. Vague, as I said. But with the portrait's message..." He trailed off, glancing at Percival, whose face had paled to the hue of skimmed milk. "Scrutinized?" Percival echoed, halting his circuit. "Aunt Eleanor trusted me implicitly. This is libel, spectral or otherwise." "Lydia, you cannot believe..." "Believe what, cousin?" Lydia retorted from the doorway, her vinaigrette-discarded eyes ablaze. "That grandmother's ghost cries foul? Or that you've manoeuvred for this inheritance since Uncle Reginald's passing? The collections, the hall and all to the golden boy of the temple." The room crackled with the discharge, Lestrade's pen scratching like claws on slate. But Holmes interposed with a lifted hand, his voice cutting the fray like a scalpel. "Tempers serve no proof, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Finch, if I may, the Worthing Codex. Is it housed here? In the gallery, perhaps?" The solicitor nodded curtly. "In the desk drawer. Lady Eleanor's private one. Sealed since spring." I advised against agitating the waters, but she was adamant. Holmes's eyes met mine across the tumult, a spark of elucidation passing unspoken. "The desk, the one we had just rifled, its contents mundane. No codex there now, but perhaps earlier." I recalled the scatter of papers, the half-letter. Stolen, hidden. As the wrangling resumed, Percival protesting his innocence with barrister's eloquence, Lydia subsiding into sniffles, Holmes leaned toward me, his whisper for my ear alone. "The scuff marks, Watson. The ochre on the carpet. Not from the gallery dust. It's raw sienna, pigment from an artist's palette. And the library air. Cyanide vapor, yes, but trace amounts, as from a phial uncorked in haste. Our forger panicked, perhaps, spilling more than intended." My mind raced, piecing the fragments. The altered portrait demanding the codex's secrets. The poison a silencing stroke, the locked door a feint. Then the codex is the key, stolen to bury the truth, or wielded as a weapon, Holmes concurred, rising as if the thought propelled him. "Excuse me, gentlemen." Watson to the desk once more. The game's pace quickens. We slipped away amid the clamour, the drawing-room's voices fading to a distant hum, and returned to the library's hush. Holmes delved into the desk anew, his fingers questing like ferrets in a warren, until he unearthed a false bottom in the central drawer, a compartment sprung by a hidden latch. revealing a slender volume bound in cracked morocco. The Worthing Codex, its pages yellowed, entries in a copperplate hand tallying not mere shillings but scandals, a birth in 52 unacknowledged, a marriage dissolved in shadow, and there underlined in fresh ink, Lady Eleanor's own, Percival Hargrove, born Percival Ellis, adoption forged 1862, heir by paper, not blood. The revelation hung like smoke, acrid and illuminating. Holmes closed the book gently, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. The false heir unmasked, at least on parchment, but the portrait's cry was no accident. It was a lure drawing eyes from this, and the poisoner, one who knew the Codex's bite yet sought to twist it. A floorboard creaked without, Wilkins perhaps, or a subtler shadow. Holmes pocketed the volume, his whisper urgent. "We must secure this, Watson, and watch. The trap springs soon, I fancy." As twilight bled into night, the hall's lamps kindled one by one, casting long fingers across the gallery floor. The investigation, that meticulous unspooling, had yielded its first harvest, yet the reaper's scythe hovered still, poised for the deeper cut. Continued from Section 4, we retreated from the library with the Codex a concealed weight in Holmes's inner pocket, its leather edges pressing against his waistcoat like a guilty secret. The corridor beyond seemed narrower now, the gas brackets hissing their illumination into elongated spectres that danced across the wainscoting, as if the hall itself conspired in the unfolding drama. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting Wilkins's oak-hewn form to materialize from the gloom, but the passage lay empty save for the distant clink of china from the kitchens. Preparations for a supper none would savor. Back to the drawing room? I ventured in a low tone, my footsteps muffled on the runner as we proceeded. The revelation in the Codex burned in my mind. Percival Hargrove, rechristened from Ellis, a paper heir propped upon the scaffold of adoption. It explained the portrait's accusatory scrawl, the urgency in Lady Eleanor's marginalia, a desperate bid to exhume the truth before the grave claimed her. Yet motive alone did not paint the murderer. It merely sketched the silhouette. Holmes shook his head, his stride unhurried yet purposeful like a chess master contemplating the board's mid-game. "Not yet, Watson. The Codex is a lodestone. It draws the iron filings of deceit toward it. Let us first secure our vantage, the gallery once more. From there we may observe the ripples without stirring the pond." We slipped into the chamber unannounced, the door's creak swallowed by the thickening night. The constables had withdrawn for their tea, leaving the room to its spectral tenants. Lady Eleanor's shrouded form a pale island amid the parquet sea, the portrait a looming judgment on the wall. Holmes barred the door softly behind us, then crossed to the windows, peering through the iron lattices at the fog-shrouded gardens below. Moonlight silvered the gravel paths, and far off, a lantern bobbed. The night watchman, perhaps, or a servant stealing a smoke. "Note the trellis yonder," Holmes observed, tapping the glass with a knuckle, ivy-clad, scaling to the gallery ledge. An enterprising soul might climb it, though the barbs would tear like the devil's talons. "No footprints in the beds per Lestrade's men, but damp earth lies. We shall verify come dawn." I joined him, the cold seeping through the pane, and traced the trellis's outline in the gloom. A climber, then, but the bolt, the door locked from within. "Unless accomplices, or a feint within a feint," he concurred, turning from the window with that abrupt economy of motion. The cyanide vapor in the library suggests proximity, haste. A file dashed to mask the arsenic's trace or to imply suicide. Yet Lady Eleanor's grip on her gown, clenched, not lax. She fought Watson, however briefly. The poison took her standing. Before that chair. He gestured to the low boudoir seat by the side table, its velvet cushion indented as from recent occupancy, a lace doily askew beside the cocoa cup. I knelt to examine it anew, my medical bag procured from the hansom earlier now yielding a pipette and vial. The dregs yielded a cloudy sediment, sharp with metallic bite under the tongue, a confirmative twinge of arsenic as the surgeon had decreed. But Holmes meanwhile had appropriated my glass, sweeping it over the portrait's frame once more. The flake of gesso he'd noted earlier had companions now, under magnification. Minute splinters embedded in the carpet fibers below, as if the canvas had been tilted fractionally from its moorings. Disturbed, but not removed, he mused, his breath fogging the lens. The forger worked in situ, bold or desperate. And this pigment, Watson, the crimson, not common vermilion, but a lake derived from cochineal blended with lead white for opacity. Costly for a mere threat. Acquired from a specialist supplier, perhaps, Colnagi's on Pall Mall or that obscure restorer in Soho. As he spoke, a soft rap echoed at the door. 3 measured knocks, insistent yet deferential. Holmes shot me a glance, his finger to his lips, then crossed to unbar it a crack. Inspector Lestrade's ferret face peered through, his bowler askew and a cigar butt clenched in his teeth. Holmes, dash it, there you are. The family's in a rare taking. Percival's demanding a private word with you, swears he's got evidence to clear his name. And that butler Wilkins, clammy as a haddock, won't meet my eye. You find anything in the library? Holmes eased the door wider, admitting the inspector with a nod. Echoes, Lestrade. Echoes of ledgers and lineages. But Mr. Hargrove's evidence? Let us hear it. Lead on. The drawing-room had devolved into a tableau of frayed nerves under the chandelier's prismatic glow, its crystals tinkling faintly in the draught from the ill-fitting sashes. Percival stood by the mantel, a tumbler of brandy in hand, his earlier poise eroded to a restless fidget, fingers drumming the stem, eyes shadowed by the fire's ruddy light. Lydia had subsided onto a settee, a lap rug drawn about her shoulders, her garnets dull against the bombazine. Finch pored over his documents at the table, quill-scratching amendments, while Wilkins hovered at the sideboard, decanting more libations with mechanical precision. Percival, old chap, Lestrade began, clapping the young man on the shoulder. Mr. Holmes is here. Out with it, then. What's this evidence? Percival straightened, draining his glass with a grimace, then set it down with deliberate care. It's the merest trifle, Inspector, but in light of that infernal scrawl, last month Aunt Eleanor confided in me. A prank, she called it. She'd engaged an artist from the Royal Academy, a Mr. Elias Crowe, to restore the portrait subtly, adding a hidden inscription beneath the varnish, visible only under raking light. A family jest, tied to grandmother's old tales of false heirs, to keep the nephews honest, she laughed. But Crowe, dash it, he quarrelled with her over payment, stormed off vowing revenge. I have his card here. He fished a creased vellum from his waistcoat, extending it to Holmes. Elias Crowe, portraitist and restorer, studio at Mecklenburgh Square. Discretion assured. Holmes perused it with arched brow, the embossed palette and brush emblem catching the lamplight. Intriguing, Mr. Hargrove. A restorative prank, yet the alteration we see is overt, accusatory. And Mr. Crowe's hand? The thickening at the F suggests a southpaw's haste, whereas your aunt's artists typically favour the right. But the quarrel? Payment withheld, you say? Percival nodded vigorously, colour returning to his cheeks. Precisely. She docked him for shoddy work on a lesser canvas, a Worthing miniature. He ranted of ingrates and ghosts from the grave. If anyone's motive smacks of the theatrical, it's Crowe, an outsider, scaling the trellis under fog's cover. Lestrade snorted, snatching the card. A lead at last. I'll have my lads round him up by morning. Studio turned inside out. Good show, Hargrove. He bustled toward the door, barking orders to a waiting constable, his notebook flapping like a banner. Lydia stirred from her settee, her voice a thin reed. A prank? Aunt Eleanor said nothing to me of such folly. And Mr. Crowe, I've seen his work. Competent but cold, like painting over a wound. Her eyes flicked to Percival, accusation veiled in sorrow. But if it's revenge, cousin, why that phrase? The air is false. It cuts too near the bone for mere spite. Percival's jaw tightened, his moustache quivering. Jealousy, Lydia, yours or the artist's? Aunt favoured me, true, but the codex? Folklore, nothing more. Grandmother's ledgers were burned with her effects. Father said as much. At the mention, Holmes's gaze sharpened, though he masked it with a sip from the sherry Wilkins had pressed upon him. The codex, yes, a relic of rigour, as Miss Hargrove described. Mr. Finch, you advised against its disturbance. Did Lady Eleanor share its contents with you last evening? The solicitor looked up from his scribblings, spectacles slipping to the bridge of his nose. Vaguely, Mr. Holmes. Entries of historical interest, births and bequests from the 50s. She wished to cross-reference with the will, ensure no oversights. But the volume itself? In her desk, sealed. I left at 10, as stated. No opportunity for perusal. Wilkins, lingering with tray in hand, cleared his throat, a gravelly interjection. "Begging pardon, sirs, but her ladyship did unseal it briefly after Mr. Finch departed. Master Percival was with her then. I served the cocoa myself, saw the Morocco binding on the table. Truth's a bitter brew," she quipped, poor soul. Percival whirled on the butler, his face flushing crimson. "Lies! I bid her good night at once, went straight to my rooms. You meddle, Wilkins. Always have since I was a boy at your knee." The room tensed, the air thickening like curdling milk, but Holmes interposed with quiet authority, his voice threading the discord. "Enough, gentlemen. Accusations without alloy weaken the chain. Wilkins, your long service merits trust, yet memory plays tricks in grief's shadow. Mr. Hargrove, this card of crows, we shall pursue it, rest assured. But night advances. Perhaps a collation would steady us all." The suggestion diffused the storm, Wilkins bowing out to summon trays from the kitchens, while Lestrade dispatched a runner to the yard for Crow's particulars. As the group dispersed, Lydia to her chambers with a murmured good night, Finch to pore over clauses by firelight, Holmes drew me aside to the alcove, his whisper masked by the long case clock's chime marking the hour. 11. A fine misdirection, Watson, that artist's card. Genuine, I'll wager, but planted like a decoy pheasant. Percival's cuff bore ochre yesterday. Today it's brushed clean, yet the scuff in the library lingers. And Wilkins' memory, convenient, placing the codex in play before the poison. He saw, or claimed to see, yet his hands when pouring bore no tremor of arsenic's residue. I digested this, the supper arriving in savoury wafts of roast and claret that belied the pall. Then Percival, to silence the codex's whisper. "But the locked door, a thread will tug anon," Holmes replied, seating himself at table with the others, his demeanour the picture of urbane detachment. "For now, observe." Finch consults his watch furtively. Lydia's garnets hide a locket unclasped. "And our butler?" He polishes silver with undue vigour. Supper unfolded in fits of civility, platters of game pie and syllabub passed in silence, broken only by Lestrade's grumblings of the yard's inefficiencies. Percival toyed with his fork, discoursing on Crow's supposed grudges with rehearsed fervour, while Lydia picked at her portion, her eyes remote as if communing with ancestral shades. Finch ate methodically, interjecting legal caveats, but I noted his gaze straying to the gallery door, as if the portrait's gaze pierced the walls. Holmes, for his part, contributed sparingly, a query on the trellis's maintenance, a remark on cochineal's rarity, each probing like a lancet, drawing beads of information without spilling blood. As the cloth was drawn and pipes lit, he rose, citing fatigue from the journey, and I followed suit, bidding the company good night. Our chambers, allotted on the upper floor, a pair of guest rooms with views of the stables, offered scant comfort. 4 posters swagged in damask, a ewer of tepid water on the washstand. Yet Holmes, far from retiring, paced the turkey rug like a caged panther, the codex now on the escritoire under lamplight. He flipped its pages with reverence, tracing entries in Mrs. Worthing's copper plate. The shadowed adoption of 1862, notarized by a long-defunct clerk. Whispers of Ellis lineage, paupers elevated by Hargrove gold. The false heir, he murmured, yet not without allies. Note the endorsement here. Finch's predecessor, but the ink bleeds as if amended later. Forgery upon forgery, Watson. A palimpsest of perfidy. A floorboard groaned without subtle, yet Holmes's head snapped up, extinguishing the lamp with a breath. Moonlight slanted through the casement, silvering the room, and we waited. Breaths held, as footsteps padded past, soft-souled, hesitant. Toward the stair. "Wilkins," I whispered, but Holmes forestalled me, slipping to the door and easing it ajar. The corridor lay dim, save for a flicker at the landing, the butler's candle guttering as he descended to the lower halls. "Follow at distance," Holmes instructed, donning his ulster against the chill. The night holds confessions yet unspoken. We trailed him thus, shadows among shadows, down the creaking treads to the servants' wing. The butler's pantry lay at the corridor's end, its door ajar, spilling a wedge of light. Wilkins entered, setting the candle on a deal table strewn with accounts, wages, stores, a half-ledger mirroring the codex's format. He rummaged in a cupboard, withdrawing a file, glass stoppered with a residue glinting like frost. Cyanide, my mind supplied, the vapor's source. Holmes tensed beside me, but before we could advance, a second figure materialized from the gloom. Percival in dressing gown and slippers, his face a mask of urgency. "Wilkins, you have it," he hissed, voice low but carrying in the hush. The butler straightened, file in hand, his oak features cracking with conflict. "Master Percival, Her ladyship's orders were plain: safeguard the codex, reveal only at the reading. But the message on the portrait, it points to you." "If the yard, damn the yard," Percival snapped, seizing the old man's arm. "The codex is ash by now, burned as father intended. But this?" He tapped the file. "For Crow, if he shows. A warning, nothing more. You swore loyalty to the true Hargroves, not some Ellis upstart's ghost." Wilkins recoiled, file clinking to the table. "True Hargroves? Your mother's blood was Worthing's own, sir, legitimate as the dawn. But the adoption, it was mercy, not deceit. Lady Eleanor saw the ledger's truth too late. So that's why the artist, why the scroll, to force your hand before Finch probates. The pieces cascaded. Percival, complicit in the forgery to preempt exposure. Dosing the cocoa not with death's intent but warning, arsenic trace, cyanide feint. Yet Lady Eleanor's fall. Accidental escalation or deliberate silencing?" Holmes' hand clamped my wrist. "Wait." But as Percival lunged for the file, a cry rent the night from the gallery. Lydia's voice shrill with terror. "The portrait, it moves." We bolted, the men's altercation forgotten, racing through the halls as the hall awoke in tumult, lamps kindling, voices rising. The gallery door hung open, Lestrade's bellow echoing within. We burst into chaos, the portrait askew on its hooks, the canvas slashed in ragged strokes, Mrs. Worthing's face rent from lip to ledger. And before it, Lydia prostrate in a faint, her garnet brooch unclasped, the locket within bearing a miniature, not of a lover, but of Percival as a babe, marked P.E. The true heir? Finch knelt by her, reviving salts in hand, his face ashen. She came down for a tonic, saw a shadow, or so she gasped. But this, vandalism atop murder. Holmes surveyed the ruin, his eyes alight with the hunt's fervor. "Not vandalism, Mr. Finch, vindication. The game veers, gentlemen, toward its check." As dawn's grey fingers clawed the horizon, the stakes had risen, the false leads fracturing under truth's inexorable weight. The heir's mask slipped, yet deeper shadows lingered, promising revelations yet to dawn. Continued from Section 5, the tumult in the gallery crested like a wave breaking on jagged rocks, voices overlapping in a cacophony of accusation and alarm as Lestrade's constables swarmed in, their boots thudding against the parquet like the pulse of some frantic heart. Lydia, revived by Finch's salts, lay limp against the solicitor's arm, her eyes fluttering open to the desecrated canvas, Mrs. Worthing's painted visage, now a grotesque maw, the slashes weeping beads of linseed oil that pooled on the floor like congealing blood. The locket, slipped from her fingers in the faint, lay open on the rug, its miniature catching the first pallid rays of dawn slanting through the bars, a cherubic infant with Percival's sharp jawline, the inscription etched in diminutive script beneath. Percival Hargrove burst through the throng moments later, his dressing gown askew and face drained of all colour. The file from Wilkins' pantry clutched forgotten in his fist. "What fresh devilry is this?" he cried, his barrister's timbre cracking on the edge of hysteria. He lunged toward the portrait, only to recoil as if struck, his eyes locking on the locket. "Lydia, sister mine, what madness! That miniature, it's from Mother's locket, the one she wore to her grave. How came it here?" Lydia stirred, her voice a ragged whisper as she pushed upright, Finch steadying her with uncharacteristic tenderness. I could not sleep, cousin. The codex haunted me. Aunt's words in the library, her suspicions. So I came for the tonic in the desk and the shadow. It moved across the canvas, swift as sin. Then the blade, oh God, the face. She clutched at her throat, the garnets rising and falling with laboured breaths. The locket? It was grandmother's, passed to mother, then to me. But that inscription, mother added it in her last fever. P, the true heir? She believed you legitimate, Percival. Blood of the Worthings, not some Ellis forgery. Why deface it now? To bury the truth forever? The room hung on her words, the air electric with implication, and I saw Lestrade's eyes narrow, his notebook flipping open like a predator's jaws. Hold hard there, miss. This locket, proof of what exactly? And you Hargrove, skulking below stairs with the butler at this hour? My man saw you from the landing. He nodded to a ruddy-cheeked constable, who affirmed with a grunt. His lantern swinging to illuminate the file in Percival's grip. Clear glass. A crystalline dreg swirling within like trapped stars. Percival thrust it forward as if it burned him, his hand trembling. Prussic acid for rats in the cellars. Wilkins can vouch. The infestations plagued us since summer. I heard Lydia's cry from the pantry, raced up empty-handed. This, mere coincidence. But his gaze darted to the slashed canvas, then to Holmes, who stood apart by the side table, his silhouette framed against the dawn's creeping glow, fingers steepled in that familiar edifice of contemplation. Holmes accepted the file without comment, uncorking it briefly to inhale, a faint almond whiff confirming my earlier suspicion, then resealing it with a twist. Coincidence, Mr. Hargrove? Or choreography? The portrait's mutilation is no blind rage. Note the precision of the cuts. 3 parallel strokes left to right, severing the mouth and ledger with surgical intent. Not to destroy, but to silence. And the locket's placement, tumbled artfully as if in staged distress. Miss Hargrove, you saw a shadow. Describe it, if you will. Height, gait. Lydia blinked, gathering her wits like scattered pearls, her bombazine whispering as she rose unsteadily. Tall, cloaked perhaps in a greatcoat against the chill. It slipped behind the easel yonder, the one Uncle Reginald used for sketches. And then the blade flashed, silver in the moonlight. Gone by the door to the gardens, I swear, unbolted for an instant. Then clicked shut. Lestrade pounced, striding to the garden door, a French casement of leaded panes, its bolt a simple thumb latch scarred by weather. Unbolted. But earlier, sealed tight as a drum, he wrestled it open, a gust of fog-laden air billowing in, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant coal smoke. The gravel beyond gleamed slick under dew, the trellis a black lattice against the paling sky. Footprints? Hargreaves, fetch the plaster kit. If someone's legged it this way— But Holmes forestalled the sergeant with a raised hand, his voice calm amid the frenzy. A diversion, Inspector, ingenious yet flawed. The bolt's latch bears no fresh scratches. It yields to a practiced thumb from within. And the shadow Miss Hargrove glimpsed? Cloaked, you say? Yet the night was mild for October, no need for such garb indoors. No, the intruder was no outsider this time. The stage was set from the wings. Percival's face twisted, a blend of outrage and dread. You impugn me, sir. After Crow's card, my evidence dismissed as chaff, I am the victim here, the heir branded false, my mother's legacy rent asunder. He gestured wildly at the locket, now retrieved by Finch and held aloft like a talisman. See, the true heir, proof against the Codex's lies. Aunt Eleanor was senile, bewitched by old ghosts. I loved her, would never— Love, Holmes interjected softly, his grey eyes pinning the young man like a lepidopterist his specimen, is a potent motive, Mr. Hargrove, often indistinguishable from fear. You spoke last evening of the portrait's prank, Mr. Crow's restoration. Yet the pigments we traced, cochineal lake, rare and traceable, match samples from your uncle's Venetian glass catalogues, not an Academy hack's palette. And your cuff yesterday ochre-dusted, today pristine, a hasty ablution perhaps after the night's labours. The accusation hung, sharpening the room's edge, and I saw Wilkins materialize in the doorway, his livery impeccable despite the hour, face a mask of feigned impassivity. Sirs, he intoned, dawn breaks. The watchman reports no breaches in the gardens. Shall I summon breakfast? The family's strength must be restored. Lestrade waved him off gruffly, turning to Percival with the bulldog tenacity that had earned him his stripes. Right then, Hargrove, you're with me to the pantry. That file, the shadows below stairs. Circumstantial, maybe, but it stinks. And this locket business, mother's proof of your truth. Convenient popping up now. My lads'll comb your rooms, if there's a blade with oil on it, or a cloak reeking of almonds. Percival submitted with a barrister's dignity, though his shoulders slumped as Lestrade led him away, the constable trailing like a bailiff. Lydia watched them go, her expression a tumult of pity and doubt, then turned to Holmes with a plea in her eyes. He is family, Mr. Holmes, flawed, ambitious, but no murderer. The Codex. Aunt showed it to me once in confidence. The adoption was mercy, yes, Father's brother, childless, took Percival from the workhouse after the Ellis fever took his parents. But Mother's locket suggests more. She whispered of a secret marriage, a Worthing bloodline hidden to shield from scandal. If Percival slew to preserve that, speculation serves the innocent ill, Miss Hargrove, Holmes replied, though his tone held a gentleness rare in such crucibles. Rest now. Dr. Watson will attend. The truth emerges not from whispers, but from the residue they leave. He nodded to me, and I guided her toward the corridor, her arm light on mine, the garnets cool against my sleeve. As we ascended, her murmur reached me. The shadow wore a crest pin, Doctor, like Father's, the fox's head. But Percival's is chipped enamel. This gleamed whole. I filed the detail away, a splinter in the edifice of suspicion, and returned to the gallery to find Holmes and Finch alone amid the wreckage. The solicitor had righted the portrait as best he could, propping it against the wall, the slashes gaping like wounds in Mrs. Worthing's stern visage. A tragedy compounded, Finch sighed, adjusting his spectacles. The will's reading must proceed. Probate waits for no desecration. Percival inherits prima facie, but with this, Cloud. The codex, if produced, could contest it. Lady Eleanor sealed it away, but if stolen... Holmes, who had been sifting the carpet fibres with my glass, straightened at that, his expression unreadable. Stolen or safeguarded? The volume we retrieved from the desk, intact, Mr. Finch, though its secrets are now under lock and key at Baker Street, courtesy of my dispatch bag. But tell me, your firm notarized the adoption in '62. Did Mrs. Worthing's ledger figure then? An endorsement perhaps forged in haste. Finch paled, his ledger slipping from his grasp to thud on the table. Forged? Preposterous. I apprenticed under old Mr. Hargreave, who handled it. The papers were ironclad. Percival's parents, artisans in the glass trade, deceased of typhus. Sir Reginald claimed him as ward, later heir. But the ledger. Beatrice Worthing audited all. If it marked illegitimacy, why endorse? Unless... He trailed off, brow furrowing as if unearthing a buried clause. Unless the endorsement was posterior, Holmes supplied, his voice a silken snare. Added to legitimize what Mercy began. As palimpsest as I suspected. Ink over ink, truth over convenience. And Percival? He knows the peril. Hence the portrait's preemptive cry, the file's threat to crow. Yet the slashes tonight. An escalation silencing the silencer. Finch nodded slowly, gathering his papers with hands that betrayed a quiver. Then Lestrade's quarry is just... The lad's always chafed at the bit. Courts by day, gaming dens by night. Debts, perhaps, to fund his temple ambitions. A motive aplenty if the inheritance slips, I interjected then, recounting Lydia's whisper of the crest-pin, whole, not chipped, and Holmes's eyes gleamed, a spark in the gathering light. "Ah, Watson," the fox unmuzzled. "Percival's is worn from consultation, as I noted. Another's gleams pristine. A duplicate or a predecessor's heirloom? We must inventory the family relics. The drawing-room cabinet? Perhaps." As the sun crested fully, gilding the gallery in reluctant gold, breakfast arrived on silver trays borne by a bleary-eyed Elsie. The housemaid whose dawn scream had set this reel in motion. She curtsied low, averting her eyes from the shrouded form, and murmured of fresh scones and Darjeeling. The household assembled in fragments, Lestrade returning triumphant from the pantry, with a rat-trap baited but unused, Percival under guard in the morning room, his denials echoing faintly. Over kippers and toast, the inspector expounded his theory with relish. "It's him, Holmes, clear as the Thames at low tide. The file, the timing, that card planted to throw us off. We'll have a confession by noon, mark me." Holmes partook sparingly, his plate a mere prop as he observed the assembly. Lydia pale but composed. Finch abstracted over his tea, Wilkins pouring with mechanical grace. Yet beneath the civility, I sensed the undercurrent. A riptide pulling toward Percival, the evidence aligning too neatly, like pieces forced into a jigsaw's frame. The crest-pin, the locket's contradiction, the portrait's second assault. They whispered of a deeper orchestration, a puppeteer beyond the obvious suspect. As the meal concluded, and Lestrade hauled Percival toward a waiting brougham for the yard, Holmes lingered by the window, watching the gravel scatter under hooves. "Too perfect, Watson," he murmured, turning to me with that predatory smile. "The noose tightens on the wrong neck. But fear not. We shall loosen it, and draw the true quarry into the light. The morning unfolded thus in interrogations and inventories, the hall a hive of constabular buzz, yet with each deposition, Elsie's tearful account of the cocoa's preparation, the watchman's log of uneventful rounds, the misdirection solidified, pointing inexorably to the nephew. Holmes, however, slipped away mid-morn to the attics, unearthing Sir Reginald's old sketchbooks amid dust-shrouded crates, his silence a barometer of brewing storm. By luncheon, as thunder grumbled on the horizon, he returned with a fox-headed pin in his palm, pristine, heavy and monogrammed not with PH, but J.F. Finch's. I realized with a jolt the solicitor's secret gleaming hole. The stakes ever rising, now tilted toward an alliance unforeseen, the web spinner revealed in glint of silver. The discovery of the fox-headed pin nestled in the folds of Sir Reginald's sketchbook, a pristine relic, its enamel unmarred by time's careless touch, sent a shiver through me that had little to do with the attic's pervasive chill. Dust-laden air swirled in the thin beam from my bull's-eye lantern, motes eddying like conspirators around Holmes as he held the bauble aloft, turning it to catch the glint of a sunbeam piercing the grimed dormer. The monogram etched on its reverse, J.F. in the florid script of a bygone apprentice, sealed its provenance with damning finality. Finch, the dry solicitor with his ledgers and caveats, harboured not merely knowledge of the family's shadowed ledgers, but the means to impersonate its guardians. Finch! Holmes breathed, the word a scalpel's edge, his grey eyes alight with that feral intensity that betokened the chaser's quickening pulse. He slipped the pin into his waistcoat, alongside the codex and the file, his movements precise yet charged, as if the very air hummed with unspoken velocities. The unmuzzled fox, Watson, pristine because seldom worn, lest it betray the hand that borrows another's authority. He donned Percival's guise in the night, slashing to bury the locket's plea for legitimacy. But why? The codex indicts the nephew. The locket defends him. Finch maneuvers between, a puppeteer severing strings that tangle his web. I steadied the lantern, my free hand brushing cobwebs from a crate stamped with Hargrove crest, relics of Venetian shipments, glass shards winking like accusations. Then the portrait's alteration, the poison. Finch's hand threw out, but the locked door the cyanide feint. A solicitor's precision, Holmes, not a barrister's bluster. Precisely, he replied, his voice dropping to that confidential timbre reserved for the denouement's prelude. Finch audited the codex last spring, per his own admission, saw the adoption's frailty, the Ellis taint. Yet as the firm's scion, he stands to inherit the Hargrove retainership, a fortune in fees from estate wrangles. Lady Eleanor's codicil threatened that. Scrutiny of the heirship would drag his ledgers through chancery mud, exposing not just Percival's paper blood, but perhaps his own emendations. Forged endorsements, Watson, ink over mercy as the palimpsest suggests. He poisoned to preempt, forged the portrait to deflect, slashed to discredit the counterclaim. And the file, a prop like the artist's card to arm the false trail. His pacing commenced then, erratic in its fervour, not the languid prowl of Baker Street reverie, but a caged tempest, heels rapping the joists like Morse upon a wire. He seized a sketchbook at random, flipping its pages with fingers that blurred, diagrams of glass lattices yielding to frantic marginalia in his own swift shorthand, timelines branching like lightning, motives forked as yew-boughs. See here, the cocoa at 10:30 Wilkins tray. Finch departed at 10, but the blotter's indents show the codicil drafted post facto, her hand steady till 11. He returned via the trellis? No, too crude. The library door ajar, a servant's passage muffled, prussic vapour to cloud the air, arsenic in the cup swapped in the shadows, then the bolt thrown, the message daubed by lamplight, cochineal from the attic's pigments, no doubt. I followed his whirlwind, the lantern swinging to illuminate his chalked deductions on a forgotten blackboard, half-erased equations from Reginald's amateur astronomy, now overwritten with suspect arcs, Percival, alibi chambers, Lydia, motive envy, Wilkins, loyalty conflicted, Finch, access absolute, but the second assault, the slashing. Lydia's shadow bore the crest, whole as this pin. Finch, cloaked in greatcoat against paint spatters fleeing to the gardens for show. Holmes halted abruptly. his face inches from mine, breath quick as a fanned bellows. Yes, and the locket? Planted from Lydia's jewel case, unlocked with a solicitor's duplicate key. He overheard her murmur of the inscription, knew it contradicted the codex. Slash the portrait, feint the witness, drop the talisman. Chaos to cloak his flight. But why escalate now? To ask the will's probate at noon. Lestrade hauls Percival to the yard, clearing the field. Finch probates unchallenged, buries the codex in appeals till the fees flow eternal. Thunder muttered closer, a low growl underscoring his agitation, and he dashed the sketchbook aside, striding to the dormer to fling it wide. Rain lashed in, spattering the floorboards, but he leaned into the gale undaunted, inhaling the ozone as if it fueled his frenzy. We must descend, confront him before the reading. Lestrade's blunder with the nephew buys us time, but Finch sensed the wind shifting. Watson, dispatch a wire to the yard, hold Percival. Evidence mounts against another. I nodded, pocketing the lantern and hurrying after as he bounded down the attic stair, his ulster flapping like raven wings. The hall below stirred with midday bustle, maids fluttering like startled pigeons, constables tramping the corridors with muddy boots, but Holmes navigated it with predatory grace, bypassing the morning room where Percival's protests echoed faintly under guard. We gained the drawing room to find Finch enthroned at the table, his ledger splayed like a battle map. Lydia perched opposite in subdued conference, her garnet subdued in the storm's grey light. Wilkins hovered at the sideboard, polishing a salver with compulsive strokes, his eyes flicking to the clock's relentless march toward noon. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Finch greeted, his parchment voice unruffled as he closed the ledger with a snap. "The attics yield their treasures? Sir Reginald's folios are a labyrinth, I warn you. Glass notes, mostly. Tangled with his stargazing fancies, Holmes seated himself unbidden, his chair scraping like a challenge, and fixed the solicitor with a gaze that peeled layers from an onion. Treasures indeed, Mr. Finch, relics of rigor and restoration. This pin, for instance." He produced it with a flourish, laying it on the table's baize, the fox's eyes gleaming balefully in the lamplight. "Prantine from the 50s. Your initials, I perceive. Not worn today, however. Reserved for nocturnal forays?" "One." Finch's spectacles slipped a fraction, his hand arresting mid-reach for the decanter, fingers blanching on the crystal. My pin. Lost these years, mislaid in the firm's vaults, I thought. How curious it surfaces now. His recovery was swift, the lawyer's mask resettling, but I noted the pulse at his temple, a telltale flutter beneath the beakish nose. Lydia leaned forward, her eyes widening at the sight. Uncle Josiah's crest, father's duplicate, the spare from mother's case. But why in the attics? And the shadow I glimpsed. The gleam, as I told the doctor. Holmes ignored the interjection, his erratic energy coiling tighter, leg jiggling beneath the table like a seismograph tracing subterranean quakes. Curious, yes, or calculated. Like the cochineal in the attic's paint box, matching the portrait's crimson. Or the cyanide phial in Wilkins' pantry, its stopper etched with a legal firm's monogram, Hargreave and Finch, embossers of deceit since '55, the room stilled. The rain's patter on the panes a conspiratorial hush, and Finch's composure fractured, a bead of sweat tracing his collar. "Preposterous, sir. I am a man of law, not legerdemain." "The file?" "For document preservation. Prussic salts, harmless in dilution. And the pin? A coincidence, nothing more. Percival's the storm's eye. The codex indicts him. Lestrade has him now." "Ah, but the locket defends," Holmes countered, his voice rising in that staccato cadence of revelation's brink, fingers drumming the table like telegraph keys. "Policy P.E., the true heir. Are you doing, Mr. Finch, to muddy the waters?" "No, slashed away to drown the contradiction. Lady Eleanor discovered your emendations in the codex, the forged endorsement of '62, inking over the Ellis truth to secure your fees. She drafted the codicil to expose it. You returned via the library, dosed the cocoa, daubed the portrait as deflection. Locked the door on your exit, a flourish of cyanide to feign suicide's scent. Then tonight, the escalation, your pin as alibi's ghost slashing to frame the air anew. Finch surged to his feet, the decanter toppling in a claret flood that stained the baize like spilled lifeblood. Lies, slanderous fiction from a detective's fevered brain. I loved Eleanor. handled her affairs with probity. The Codex, historical dross. The adoption mercy, notarized clean. Call Lestrade, let him sift this calumny. But Holmes was upon him in a blur, seizing the ledger from the table and flipping it open to a dog-eared page, his free hand clamping the solicitor's wrist like a manacle. Probity? Then explain this. Your marginal note in sepia matching the blotter's indents. Secure PH bequest. BW entry amended per RH Directive 1863. Post-adoption Mr. Finch. A year late, ink bled as if overlaid. You forged it then, under Reginald's nod, to legitimize the ward for the estate's sake. But Eleanor unearthed the original. Threatened to probate the truth, stripping your firm's golden goose. Lydia gasped, rising to clutch the table's edge, her face a porcelain mask of betrayal. Josiah, you? The shadow with father's pin. To protect the fees. Aunt trusted you, confided the Codex's bite. Wilkins, from the sideboard, let the salver slip with a clang, his oak facade splintering. I knew, miss. Saw him slip back at 10:45, tray in hand. A forgotten clause, he said. But the file from his case dashed in the lock after. For the heir, he claimed, but her ladyship coughed, clutched. I thought it the room. Finch wrenched free, his face contorting from indignation to cornered fury, spectacles askew. Traitor! You, Wilkins, with your Crimea oaths, loyal to ghosts, not the living. Eleanor was meddling, unravelling decades of care. The Hargroves prospered under my quill. Percival's rise, the collections intact. One dose swift and merciful to spare the scandal. The portrait. A warning to steer the yard to the boy. And the slash. To end the farce, the locket's lie planted by her in senility. The confession erupted like the thunder's crack overhead, rain now sheeting the windows in silver veils, and I lunged for the bell pull, summoning the constables with frantic yanks. Holmes, his erratic storm subsiding to a taut wire, produced handcuffs from his ulster, ever prepared. My friend, and snapped them on Finch's wrists as Lestrade burst in, soaked and bellowing from the drive. Blazes, Holmes, what's this? Percival's singing like a canary at the yard. Crows card a plant, he swears. And now, redirect your choir, Inspector, Holmes interjected, his voice steadying to its silken norm, though his eyes still burned with the chase's afterglow. Mr. Finch here composes the dirge. The codex, the pin, the file, irrefutable. Percival's innocence. Release him post-haste. As the solicitor was hauled away, sputtering legal apothegms into the gale, Lydia collapsed weeping into Wilkins' arms, the butler's murmur a balm of long service. Holmes turned to the window, watching the brougham vanish into the downpour, his erratic vigour ebbing to contemplative calm. The stakes rise, Watson, yet the board clears. But echoes linger. The Codex's deeper shadows, Reginald's directive. A third thread, perhaps, in this tapestry of false heirs. By afternoon's sullen wane, with Percival returned exonerated, and the hall's lamps kindled against the tempest, Holmes retreated to the library, his violin keening a dirge that wove through the rain's tattoo. The mystery intensified, revelations piling like storm clouds, yet the true sequence teased at the edges of vision, erratic, insistent, drawing us toward the heart's concealed stroke. The violin's lament faded into the rain's relentless susurrus, its final quaver lingering like a question unanswered in the library's vaulted hush. Holmes lowered the Stradivarius with a sigh that was half exhaustion, half exhilaration, the bow's horsehair glistening with rosin under the gas jet's fitful glow. I had watched him through the afternoon's sullen vigil, his fingers dancing across the strings with an abandon that mirrored the storm outside, erratic bursts of fury giving way to plaintive cadences, as if the instrument were an extension of the mind that had just unravelled Finch's intricate deceit. The solicitor's arrest had quelled the household's immediate tempest, Percival pacing the halls with a barrister's vindicated bluster, Lydia retreating to her chambers with tear-streaked gratitude, and Wilkins resuming his rounds with the stoic tread of one who had unburdened a lifetime's oath. Yet Holmes, ever the sentinel against complacency, had retreated here, the codex open on the desk beside a decanter of untouched brandy, its pages a palimpsest of scandals that refused to lie flat. Watson, he said at length, propping the violin on its stand with reverent care, the board is cleared of pawns, but the king's gambit lingers. Finch's confession, mercy, he called it, a swift end to Eleanor's meddling. Yet the codex's endorsement, That RH directive of 1863, Reginald's hand or another's? The ink bleed suggests tampering, but whose quill dipped first? I poured us both a measure of brandy, the amber liquid catching the light like captured sunset, and handed him a glass. My own nerves, frayed by the night's revelations and the day's deluge, craved the fortification. Reginald's ghost, perhaps, dead these 5 years, yet pulling strings from the grave. The sketchbooks in the attic bore his marginalia, notes on glass forgeries, false gleams mirroring Eleanor's phrase. If he orchestrated the adoption's veil, Finch merely mended the seam when it frayed. Holmes sipped sparingly, his eyes distant as the boughs echo, tracing the rain trails on the pane. A veil, yes, but woven from necessity or avarice. Percival's Ellis origins, artisans in the glass trade, felled by fever. Reginald, childless, elevates the orphan to heir, but the codex marks it as shadowed, a pauper's blood tainting the Hargrove blue. The directive amends it post facto, legitimizing for the estate's sake. Yet why a debt to the Ellis kin? Or to bury a deeper flaw, Reginald's own indiscretion, perhaps a bastard line entwined? His words hung, laced with that undercurrent of unease that so often prefaced his grander illuminations, and I felt the familiar prickle at my nape, the sense that the case, far from concluded, had merely shed its chrysalis to reveal a form more formidable. The clock on the mantel chimed 5, its bells muffled by the downpour, and from the corridor came the tread of footsteps, deliberate, unhurried, pausing at the library door. A knock followed, soft yet insistent, and Percival Hargrove entered without awaiting invitation, his dove-grey suit sodden from a foray into the gardens, moustache drooping like a wilted fern. "Mr. Holmes, doctor," he said, closing the door against the draught with a shiver, water pooling at his boots. "The constables have gone with Finch in irons, Lestrade crowing of a tidy collar. Yet something gnaws." Lydia found this in the gallery desk, an envelope sealed with father's crest dated the day after my adoption, 17th of March, 1862, addressed to Josiah Finch, but unopened till now. "She bids you read it," says Aunt Eleanor, hid it with the codex, fearing its contents would unmake us all. He extended a wax-sealed missive, its paper yellowed but intact, the fox head embossed cracked like a portent. Holmes accepted it with a nod, breaking the seal with a thumbnail, his erratic energy stirring anew as he unfolded the single sheet. I leaned in, the brandy forgotten as his eyes scanned the copperplate script. Reginald's hand, bold and unyielding. "My dear Finch, the boy is secured. Percival Ellis, now Hargrove by deed if not by blood. The fever took his parents, but their secret endures. The Ellis forge wrought not mere glass, but the false chalice of 59, palmed off on the Duke of Clarence as Murano true. I claimed the child to silence the line. His veins carry the taint of that deceit. Endorse the codex as legitimate. Ink the Worthing bond forge if need be. The collections stand on such veils. Let no ledger pierce them. Eleanor suspects. Watch her. The air must hold or the hall crumbles. Your Reginald." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the rain's tattoo, and I saw Holmes's face tighten, the pieces cascading into a mosaic more shadowed than before. "The false chalice," he murmured, refolding the letter with deliberate care. "Reginald's collection, built on forgeries, the 59 piece a linchpin. The Ellis parents, artisans turned counterfeiters, knew the truth. Their death convenient, the orphan co-opted as pawn. But Percival, blood of the deceivers, heir to a tainted throne, Finch forged to protect not just fees but the entire edifice, exposed the adoption, and the chalice's fraud unravels the provenance of every bauble in the hall." Percival sank into a chair, his dapper facade crumbling to reveal the boy beneath, eyes wide with the vertigo of unearthed lineage. "Father, a forger." The collections, Uncle Reginald's pride, loaned to the British Museum, fated at court. If this letter surfaces, the scandals cascade. Probate halts, creditors swarm, the name Hargrove dragged through the muck. Aunt Eleanor knew, brooded on the false gleam in her marginalia. That's why the codex, the codicil, to force the truth, stripped the veils before she died. Holmes paced once more, the letter clutched like a talisman, his mind visibly leaping the chasms between fact and inference. Yet Finch slew to preserve the lie, not unveil it. The portraits cried the air is false, a deflection to the adoption masking the deeper fraud. And the slashing? To destroy the locket's claim of true heir, lest it point to Worthing blood over Ellis taint. But Reginald's directive, it implicates more. Who else knew? Wilkins, perhaps. His Crimea service overlapped Reginald's collecting phase, a valet turned butler, privy to shipments from Venice. As if summoned by the name, the door creaked open anew, admitting the butler with a tray of tea, steaming pot, scones and a decanter of fresh claret, his face the epitome of unflappable service. Yet his eyes, when they alighted on the letter in Holmes's hand, betrayed a flicker, recognition swiftly veiled. "Gentlemen, Master Percival, the storm abates. Thought you might fortify. Miss Lydia sends regrets. She's abed with a headache, but bids you convey her thanks anew." Percival accepted a cup with mechanical politeness, his voice steadied by resolve. "Wilkins, did you know? Of the chalice, the forgeries? Father wrote of watching Eleanor. Were you his eyes?" The butler's hand paused on the pot, porcelain clinking faintly, and for the first time the oak of his demeanour showed grain, a subtle softening at the edges. "Master Percival, I served your father from the Indian mutiny's end. Saw the glass arrive in crates unmarked save for Ellis stamps. The chalice. A beauty, that one, but flawed under magnification, bubbles too coarse for true Murano. Sir Reginald paid the Ellises hush gold. Then the fever came. Claiming you? Mercy, he called it. But I packed the crates myself, hid the duplicates in the attics lest collectors pry." Holmes whirled on him, the letter thrust forward like an indictment. "And this directive? You endorsed the forgery in the codex, your hand perhaps steady from Crimea campaigns inking over Reginald's command." Wilkins bowed his head, the tray steady as Gibraltar. "Not I, sir, Finch's quill, but under Sir Reginald's eye. I witnessed, the night after your adoption in this very library, sealing the letter to Josiah. For the hall's sake," he said. "Lady Eleanor found the duplicate codex last spring, confronted him in her last illness. He bid me burn it, but she spirited it away. That's why the portrait obsessed her. The ledger in grandmother's hands, symbol of truths tallied. The message scrawled there? Her idea, half-formed. Finch twisted it to his ends. The revelation landed like a thunderclap anew, the tea cooling untouched as the pieces slotted with a grind of inevitability. Reginald the collector, architect of the grand deception. Finch the executor turned executioner. Eleanor the unraveller silenced too soon. Yet as Wilkins spoke, a distant clamour intruded, the front knocker's brazen clang echoing through the halls like an ill-omened tocsin. Footsteps hurried, Elsie's light patter, then Percival's rising to investigate, leaving us in the library's charged hush. Moments later, he returned, face ashen, a sodden telegram clutched in his fist. "From the yard, Lestrade. Finch escaped the Broamon route, overpowered the guard in a coaching inn, fled into the storm. Armed, they say, a pistol from his briefcase, and a second missive forwarded from the hall's post, anonymous to Aunt Eleanor, dated the day she died. The chalice gleams false. The air drinks from it. Silence or the collections shatter. Postmarked Soho, Elias Crow's haunt. Holmes' eyes blazed, the erratic storm reigniting in his frame as he snatched the wire. Escaped? No, sprung, Watson. The guard's a green lad. Finch's legal web has tendrils in the yard, and this threat Crow's hand. The artist discarded as decoy, now the avenger. For a deeper player, wielding the fraud's shadow to extort the remnants. Percival staggered to the window, peering into the gloom where lightning forked the sky. The collections, if exposed, were beggared. The museum loans, the auctions. But Crow, Aunt engaged him for the prank inscription, yes, hidden under varnish to reveal under light if the codex surfaced. He quarrelled over the forgeries she confessed, vowed to paint the truth on every canvas in London. The library door flew open then, admitting Lydia, her bombazine damp from a dash downstairs, garnets awry and eyes wild. The gallery, oh God, Holmes! The chalice, it's gone from the case, shattered on the floor, shards like ice in the rain pooling at the window, and a note pinned to the curtain, the false heir pays in glass. The sash was unlatched, someone in the storm while we spoke. We surged as one toward the gallery, the hall's corridors a blur of gaslight and shadows, thunder rumbling approbation. The chamber met us with devastation, the Sèvres cup from the cocoa night intact on its table. but Reginald's prized chalice, a vessel of filigreed deceit, once the collection's crown, now a ruin of fractured crystal, its latticework splintered into accusations. Rain lashed through the open sash, soaking the carpet, and the note, scrawled in haste on a scrap of vellum, fluttered like a moth in the gust. Holmes knelt amid the shards, gloved fingers sifting the debris with clinical detachment, his face illuminated by a lightning flash that etched his features in stark relief. Not shattered by fall, struck deliberately with a hammer's mark on the rim, and the ink, fresh sepia from the library desk. Our intruder circled close, Watson, while Finch escaped this ghost-struck to escalate. The air Percival targeted, the chalice's destruction a symbol. The false gleam exposed the bloodline's taint in shards. Lydia clutched Percival's arm, her voice a tremolo of fear. Then Crow's revenge? Or Wilkins, loyal to the old lies? The butler, trailing us, bowed low over the ruin. Not I, miss, guarding the doors till the watch changed, but the Soho postmark, Elias Crow, the restorer, aunt hired. He knew the chalice's flaw, studied it for weeks. Muttering of cracks in the crystal, cracks in the kin, Holmes rose, shards glinting in his palm like captured stars, his erratic pacing resuming amid the wreckage. Cracks indeed, spreading from Reginald's directive to this nocturnal hammer. The stakes rise, my friends. Finch at large, the collection's imperiled, a spectral hammerer in our midst. We must pursue the artist. Soho by cab ere the storm swallows his trail. Watson, your revolver. The game's veered to peril's edge. As we cloaked against the gale, the hall receding like a beleaguered fortress, the mystery's heart quickened, revelations fracturing like the chalice, drawing us into the tempest's maw, where truths and threats converged in shattering accord. The cab rattled through the storm-lashed streets like a galleon in a gale, its wheels sluicing through rivulets that cascaded from the gutters, turning the cobbles into a treacherous mirror of London's underbelly. I clutched the strap with one hand, my ulster sodden despite the hansom's meagre shelter, while with the other I steadied Holmes, who had flung himself into the far corner upon hailing the Jarvey at Hargrove Hall's gates. His face, etched by intermittent lightning, wore that mask of febrile abstraction, eyes half-lidded yet darting like mercury, fingers twitching as if still sifting the chalice's shards. Percival and Lydia had begged to accompany us, but Holmes had forestalled them with a sharp injunction. The hall is your bastion now. Bar the doors, summon the watch. This hammerer strikes at symbols. Next, it may be flesh. They had yielded, Percival's jaw set in grim resolve, Lydia's garnets flashing one last plea before the cab lurched away. Watson, Holmes burst forth suddenly, his voice a whip-crack over the thunder's roll. The note's vellum, torn from the library blotter, indentations matching Eleanor's codicil draft. Not Crow's hand. The flourish on the airs lacks the artist's flourish, too legal, too Finch-like. Yet the postmark, Soho, a blind perhaps to lure us thither while the true fox doubles back. I nodded, rain dripping from my hat brim, the revolver heavy in my coat. Then the chalice's destruction, a taunt from Finch escaped and emboldened. But the hammer's mark, blunt as from a gavel, not a pistol butt. We shouldered through the heat of Furness's moor, and there amid the inferno's cradle stood Finch, wild-eyed, pistol levelled at Percival's breast, the hammer discarded amid the pyre. The portrait writhed in flames, Mrs. Worthing's face contorting in posthumous agony, the crimson scrawl bubbling like accusations liquefied. Holmes halted, revolver raised in counterpoint, his voice a clarion over the crackle. Checkmate, Mr. Finch. The plates were duplicates. Crow's negative endures. The truth gleams false no more. The conflagration roared assent, the stakes cresting to cataclysm's brink. As the web's final strands snapped taut in the fire's unforgiving light, the flames licked upward with voracious hunger, devouring the portrait's edges in a corona of orange and black, Mrs. Worthing's stern visage warping, as if in the throes of some infernal resurrection. The gallery, once a sanctum of oaken solemnity, had transmogrified into a cauldron, smoke billowing in acrid coils that stung the eyes and clawed the throat, the gilt frame buckling with pops like pistol shots, the crimson scrawl of the forged message blistering into illegible char. Finch stood transfixed before the pyre, his solicitor's poise shattered into a rictus of defiance, the pistol in his hand a trembling extension of his fury. its barrel trained unerringly on Percival's chest, where the young man had frozen mid-lunge, arms outstretched as if to wrest the heirloom from perdition. Lydia cowered by the library door, her bombazine singed at the hem, hands pressed to her mouth in a silent scream that echoed her earlier terror. "Stay back, Holmes," Finch bellowed, his voice cracking over the roar, spectacles fogged with heat and sweat. The fox pin, recovered from his pocket in the fray, glinting mockingly on his lapel. "This farce ends in ash. The codex, the chalice, the portrait, all fuel for the truth's pyre. Eleanor meddled too far. Reginald's legacy was mine to safeguard, not hers to dismantle with her senile scribbles." Holmes advanced unhurried, his revolver steady as the North Star, though his free hand gestured subtly for me to flank left, toward the French casement, where the rain's chill might yet aid in quenching the blaze. Crow's weight dragged at my shoulder, the artist half propped against the jamb, his wound reopened by our dash, blood trickling anew down his temple to mingle with soot. "Safeguard, Mr. Finch," Holmes replied, his tone a velvet blade laced with that dry amusement that so often disarmed the desperate. Or suborn. The plate's duplicates reside now with Scotland Yard, photographic testament to the varnish's secrets. False heir, Ellis blood, chalice fraud, etched indelible. Your hammer silenced no ghosts. It merely summoned the laws. Finch's eyes darted, wild, calculating, the pistol wavering a fraction, as thunder crashed without, shaking the barred windows like divine remonstrance. Percival, emboldened by Holmes' advance, edged sideways, his barrister's cunning flickering through the fear. "Uncle Josiah, Finch, for God's sake, the hall. The collections are our tether, not kindling. Father's directive was mercy, not this madness. Yield the gun." The yard comes. Lestrade's wire precedes us. But Finch laughed, a hollow bark swallowed by the flame's hungry maw, and swung the barrel toward Holmes, his free hand fumbling in his coat for a kerchief, perhaps to staunch the smoke's assault. Mercy? Reginald's ink forged the adoption to bury the Ellises' shame, their counterfeit chalice palmed on the Duke, the hush gold that built this vault. I inked the codex at his nod, preserved the fees that fed 3 generations. Eleanor unearthed it, prattling of false gleams to that Dauber crow, commissioned her infernal inscription, varnish over venom. I overheard. A return that night, the cocoa laced with arsenic's kiss. A mercy as I told you in Soho. The portrait daub to deflect to the boy, the locked door my flourish. And tonight, the hammer to shatter the lie, the fire to consume the proof. You, Holmes, your meddling strands it all. But the flames claim victory. The heat intensified, sweat beading on my brow as I inched toward the casement. Crow's labored breaths a counterpoint to the crackle. The artist's fingers dug into my arm, his whisper ragged. The negative. I slipped a copy to my apprentice. Safe in the studio's safe. "Tell him develop at dawn." I nodded, stealing for the lunge, while Holmes, ever the strategist, pivoted on his heel. His erratic pacing from Soho's garret, reborn here in measured feint, drawing Finch's gaze to the Inferno's heart. "Victory in ash, Mr. Finch?" Holmes echoed, his revolver dipping fractionally as if conceding ground. "A solicitor's Pyrrhic, I fancy. Observe the varnish bubbles not. The hidden script endures, charring translucent. Rake the light from yonder lantern, Watson. And behold, the ledger's shadow blooms even in death." He nodded imperceptibly toward the side table, where the cocoa cup's Sèvres porcelain fractured heirloom stood sentinel, its base reflecting the blaze in prismatic mockery. Finch faltered, his eyes flicking to the table, the pistol sagging a hair's breadth, and in that instant Holmes sprang. Not a bull's charge, but a greyhound's dart. His boot hooked the discarded hammer, flinging it with unerring arc to clout Finch's wrist, the pistol discharging wild into the ceiling with a deafening crack that showered plaster like confetti. Finch howled, the weapon skittering across the parquet, and Percival surged forward, tackling the solicitor to the floor in a tangle of limbs and ledger, Finch's coat ripping to reveal a sheaf of singed documents. Codex excerpts, Reginald's letter, Crow's commission invoice, all salvaged from the desk in frantic bid for leverage. I abandoned Crow to slump against the wall, his wound staunched by will alone, and wrested the pistol from the melee, training it on Finch as Lestrade's bellow echoed from the corridor. "Holmes! By the devil, what's the blaze?" The inspector burst in with a brace of constables, sodden greatcoat steaming in the heat, buckets sloshing from the kitchen's hasty chain. They doused the pyre with disciplined fury, steam hissing skyward, the portrait's remnants collapsing in a sodden heap, Mrs. Worthing's face mercifully obscured, the varnish's secrets preserved in photographic echo. Finch, pinioned by Percival and a burly sergeant, thrashed like a landed pike, his spectacles shattered on the floor. "Treason!" he spat, blood from a split lip flecking his chin. The hall crumbles without the veils. Creditors at the gates, the museum's writs. "Reginald bid me forge. I but obeyed the dead." Holmes, breathing measured amid the subsidence, holstered his revolver and retrieved the sheaf from the coat's ruin. Papers damp but legible, Reginald's directive uppermost, its copperplate unyielding. Obeyed or usurped? The forgery was mercy's mask, Mr. Finch. Reginald shielded the boy from pauper's fate, the Ellis's shame from the scaffold. But you? You inked avarice over it, fees fattened on the fraud's continuance. Eleanor's codicil would have scrubbed it clean, probate the truth, auction the baubles as they are, rebuild on honesty. You slew for perpetuity's purse, twisted the portrait's truth to deflection, shattered the chalice to terrorize, fired this, conflagration to cauterize. But the plates endure, as does the law's unblinking eye. Lestrade, directing the dousing with oaths nautical in vigor, clapped Holmes on the shoulder as the last embers sputtered. "Dash it, man. You've netted the fox twice over." Escaped my wagon, did he? Bribed young Hargreaves with a fiver and a forged writ, slippery as the Thames. "But this—" He gestured to the sodden canvas, the pinioned Finch, ironclad. "We'll have the full confession at the yard, every quill's dip, every dose's drop." Percival rose, hauling Finch upright with the sergeant's aid, his face a mosaic of relief and revulsion, the barrister confronting the solicitor's fall. "Cousin, no more," he murmured, eyes on the charred ledger prop. "The heir false, no forged but forged in fire's trial." The hall endures, Josiah, on truth's anvil. "Not your ledgers," Lydia, emerging from her crouch, crossed to embrace her cousin, the garnets on her brooch catching the constable's lanterns in subdued gleam. The locket's whisper was right, true heir, blood or bond. "Aunt's portrait." Even in death, it testified. She turned to Crow, who had staggered upright, leaning on the doorframe like a mast adrift. "And you, Mr. Crow. Your brush unveiled what words concealed. The varnish, a legacy unburned." The artist inclined his head, pain etching deeper lines but a wry smile ghosting his lips. "Art's the truest forgery, miss. Layers over lies till light reveals. Develop the negative. Let the world see the gleam's fracture." As the constables frog-marched Finch away, his protests devolving to mutters of appeals and precedents, Holmes withdrew to the window, the rain easing to a patter that cleansed the night. His erratic storm had passed, leaving the calm of cogitation, pipe relit and contemplative. I joined him, the gallery's air still thick with char and revelation, the Sèvres cup a mute witness on the table. "A close-run thing, Holmes," I observed, holstering my revolver. The fire's brink, Finch's desperation laid bare the web's full weave. He puffed slowly, grey eyes on the garden's gloom, where the trellis dripped like a penitent. "Desperation illuminates, Watson, like varnish under rake. Reginald's mercy twisted to Finch's avarice. Eleanor's truth silenced, then resurrected in pigment and plate. The heir stands vindicated. Percival Hargrove, Ellis-born but Hargrove-hearted. Yet echoes persist. The collection's audit, the Duke's heir's shadow. Lestrade will probate clean. The scandals subside with the ashes." Percival approached then, the sheaf of papers in hand, Lydia at his side. "Mr. Holmes, our debt is incalculable. The hall," it breathes anew. "Breakfast at dawn, a toast to the unmasked." Holmes inclined his head, the thin smile of satisfaction curving his lips. "Dawn, yes, but first sleep. The game's adjourned, Mr. Hargrove. Lesser puzzles await in Baker Street. Yet mark this, truth's portrait endures not in canvas, but in the light that unmasks it. We retired thus, the hall's corridors hushed, save for the rain's diminuendo. Constables posted at the doors like sentinels against the night's remnants. In my chamber, as the candle guttered low, I pondered the night's cascade. From spectral scrawl to shattering chalice, forgery's veil rent by flame and flash. Holmes in the adjoining room I knew would pace till first light, violin keening soft variations on resolution's theme. The stakes, so perilously risen, had crested. Yet in their wake, the mystery's deeper strata gleamed, philosophical, inexhaustible, as the Thames' hidden currents. Dawn broke grey and forgiving, the fog lifting like a confessor's absolution, and over eggs and kidneys in the morning room. The household reassembled, Percival expansive in plans for the audit, Lydia serene with the locket restored to her chain, Wilkins pouring with renewed vigour, his Crimea scars badges of loyalty unbowed. Crow, bandaged and bolstered by tea, sketched idly on a napkin, the portrait reborn, ledger intact. Lestrade arrived mid-meal, telegram in hand. Finch remanded. The negative developed and damning, the Yard's case a tapestry of inks and indictments. Holmes partook sparingly, his mind evidently adrift to fresher enigmas. But as we rose to depart, the hansom summoned, Baker Street beckoning. He paused at the gallery threshold, surveying the soot-streaked walls, the pyre's scar a dark bloom on the parquet. A portrait of the dead grandmother, he mused, resurrected in verity. The false gleams fade, Watson. The true light endures, and so, as the cab bore us through the crispening air, the Hargrove shadows receding, I felt that familiar swell of admiration, the genius that pierced deception's veil with logic's unerring lance. Yet in Holmes's abstracted gaze, I divined the philosophy unspoken. In every mystery's unravelling, a deeper one coils, life's grand forgery. Waiting the rake of eternity's light, the wheels of the hansom cab ground onward through the crispening veil of morning mist. The Thames a silver serpent coiling below the embankment's gas lamps, which flickered their last before the sun's reluctant ascent banished them to obscurity. I settled back against the squabs, the revolver's weight a lingering talisman in my coat pocket, its barrel still warm from the night's grim necessities. Holmes beside me had fallen into that profound silence which so often followed the symphony's coda, his pipe unlit now, fingers steepled beneath his chin, gaze fixed on some invisible horizon where the fog met the infinite. The Hargrove affair, that intricate mosaic of pigment and poison, receded behind us like a half-remembered fever dream, yet its after-images lingered, the portrait's char-streaked remnants, the chalice's fractured gleam, Finch's final, impotent sputter as the constables bore him away in irons once more. A hansom cab rattled past in the opposite direction, its occupant, a blurred silhouette huddled against the chill, and I fancied for a moment it was Lestrade, hastening back to the Yard with his triumph freshly inked on fresh warrants. The inspector had lingered at breakfast long enough to extract Crow's deposition, the artist's southpaw scrawl detailing the varnish's veiled indictment, the quarrel's true crux not guineas but guilt, before clapping Holmes on the back with that gruff camaraderie born of shared crucibles. "You've outdone yourself this time, Holmes," he had growled over his second rasher, turning a locked-room spook into a forgery's bonfire. "The Yard owes you a case of the best. None of that Baker Street rotgut." Holmes had waved it aside with a thin smile. His response a murmured, "The credit is the crime's. Inspector, its intricacies demand the unravelling, but I, who knew the machinery beneath that detached veneer, had seen the subtle gleam in his eye. Not vanity, but the quiet satiation of logic triumphant over chaos. Percival had pressed upon us a retainer for future contingencies, the Hargrove ledgers, now to be audited under Percival's own barrister's eye, promising tangles enough for a dozen lesser men, while Lydia, her garnets polished anew, had clasped my hand with a warmth that bespoke the night's terrors, transmuted to trust. "You and Mr. Holmes," she had whispered, "guardians of truths too long shrouded. The locket rests easy now." Wilkins, ever the oak sentinel, had seen us to the door with a bow that creased his Crimea-scarred face into unaccustomed lines of relief. "The hall stands, sirs, on foundations scrubbed clean. Master Percival, he'll honour the ledgers true." And Crow, bandaged but buoyant, had sketched a hasty caricature on the breakfast linen, Holmes as a fox unmasked, ledger in paw, with the caption, "The Gleam," revealed. We had departed amid such farewells, the storm's remnants a mere drizzle now, pattering the cab's roof like an apologetic encore. "Watson," Holmes said at length, breaking the reverie with that sudden pivot which so often prefaced his deeper reflections, "you observe the hawker yonder, the one with the tray of muffins steaming against the damp. Note the grease spot on his apron, the faint scent of machine oil on his cuffs. Not a baker by trade, but a typesetter from the Fleet Street presses, supplementing wages with street cries. The muffin tray, a prop. His true cargo is the bundled papers under his arm, advance sheets from the Pall Mall Gazette, no doubt, with Lestrade's leak already in print. Spectral portrait unmasks forgery ring at Hargrove Hall. I leaned to the window, squinting through the mist at the figure trudging the pavement, his cries of "hot muffins, tuppence," a rhythmic counterpoint to the cab's clip-clop. By Jove, Holmes was right. The apron's weave bore the telltale ink stains of a compositor's toil, and the bundle's edges protruded with newsprint's ragged fringe. "Extraordinary," I replied, though the word felt threadbare after the night's prodigies. "But how does it bear on—" "It bears on everything, my dear fellow," he interjected, his voice regaining that silken edge of engagement, the pipe now between his teeth as he struck a Vesuvian with a flourish. "The press is the great unraveller or barrier of truths. Finch's fall will splash across every broadsheet, the solicitor's avarice, Reginald's merciful forgery, Eleanor's posthumous verdict in varnish and verse. Percival inherits not just the Hall but its scandals, yet in the glare the collections may yet redeem themselves. Auctions of honest fakes, perhaps. The British Museum covets even flawed Murano. For the story it tells, the cab lurched over a rut, splashing a pedestrian who cursed with the fluency of a costermonger. And I chuckled despite the chill seeping into my bones. A philosophical turn, Holmes? From arsenic's bite to auction's balm? You downplay it as ever. The genius that pierced the veil." He puffed contemplative clouds, the aroma of shag mingling with the river's brackish tang, his gaze drifting to the receding spires of Kensington. "Genius? A misnomer, Watson, mere observation sharpened by idleness. The average man sees the portrait scrawl and cries ghost. I see the cochineal's cost, the left-hand haste. The game is never the brilliance, but the board's hidden rules, deception's economy where every lie accrues interest until bankruptcy. Finch bankrupted himself on avarice, Reginald on Mercy's mortgage, and we, merely the bailiffs tallying the debts." His words carried that undercurrent of melancholy which so often shadowed his triumphs, a reminder of the void beneath the violin strings, the cocaine's whisper ever at bay yet insistent. I shifted, seeking to lighten the pall. "Yet the Hargroves emerged solvent, Holmes. Percival's resolve at breakfast, auditing the lot, truth for truth's sake. Lydia's locket, a talisman of bonds forged stronger than blood. Even Crow, his negative developed, perhaps a series of engravings for the Illustrated London News. The portrait that accused its maker." Holmes' laugh was a rare, dry bark, the pipe stem dancing between his teeth. "Engravings, aye, and ballads in the music halls, the dead dame's daub or the solicitor's sob. But mark this, Watson, the deeper coil endures. Reginald's directive, mercy, yes, but what of the Ellis's true end? Fever or a dose to quiet the counterfeiters' tongues? The Codex hints at a third hand. Wilkins' shadow in the shipments, perhaps, or a Venetian contact long buried. Lestrade will chase the ghosts. I prefer the living puzzles, the ones that walk Baker Street's fog." The cab veered into the Strand, the traffic thickening with costers' carts and omnibuses, the air alive with the cries of vendors and the toll of St. Mary's bells marking the half-hour. Baker Street loomed ahead, its familiar facades a balm after the hall's opulent gloom. Mrs. Hudson's net curtains twitching in the bay window, a promise of muffins genuine and tea untampered. As we alighted, the landlady herself emerged, shawl clutched against the damp, her face a map of maternal frets. "Mr. Holmes, doctor." "At last. I've a pot on, and the post brought this." She thrust a sheaf of letters into Holmes's hands, her eyes narrowing at his soot-flecked ulster. "Another of your queer cases? The papers are full of Hargrove horrors, poisoned cocoa and painted poltergeists. If it's not too bold, sir, the muffins are fresh. No arsenic, I vow." Holmes's smile was genuine this time, a flicker of warmth piercing the abstraction. "Your muffins, Mrs. Hudson, are the antidote to all toxins. And this post? The Yard's report, no doubt, with Finch's full confession. And here a wire. From Percival. Collections audited. Chalice shards yield a twin, true Murano hidden in attics. Your eye missed nothing. I followed him up the 17 steps, the door clicking shut behind us like the case's final latch. The familiar clutter of the sitting room enfolding us, the Stradivarius on its perch, the Persian slipper brimming with shag, the unanswered correspondence teetering on the mantel. Holmes tossed his ulster over the armchair, sinking into his seat with a sigh that bespoke the chase's end. While I busied myself with the kettle, the routine a ritual of return. As the tea steeped, steam curling like the gallery's vanished smoke, Holmes leafed the letters, Lestrade's scrawl confirming Finch's arraignment on charges manifold: murder, forgery, arson attempted. The solicitor had cracked under the negative's stark proof, the developed plates blooming under the yard's arc lamps, to reveal the ledger's shadowed script in crystalline betrayal. "The air is false no more," Holmes murmured, setting it aside. "Percival inherits untainted." The hall's ledgers balanced at last. I poured the cups, the china clinking softly, and settled opposite, the fire's fresh-laid logs crackling to life under my poker. "A satisfying resolution, then?" The web unravelled, the widow's portrait vindicated, even in char. He sipped, eyes on the flames dance, his voice threading the warmth with that philosophical thread. "Satisfying. As much as any, Watson. Logic's lance pierces, but the veil mends ever anew. Life's grand forgery persists, families forged in mercy or malice, collections of crystal and canvas veiling the voids beneath. We tally the truths, yet the deeper mysteries coil eternal. The why of the mercy, the cost of the gleam. But enough. The post brings fresher bait." He extracted a final envelope. Its seal unbroken, postmarked from the Diogenes Club. "Mycroft? No doubt. Some diplomatic tangle in the Balkans or a cipher from the Foreign Office. The game, my dear fellow, renews with the dawn." I nodded, the admiration swelling anew, that unquenchable curiosity, the detachment laced with fire, the genius that downplayed its own blaze. As Mrs. Hudson's muffins arrived on a laden tray, their aroma chasing the last ghosts of arsenic and ash, I set quill to paper, the narrative's close a mere pause in the annals. For in Holmes's companionship, every ending birthed an inception. Every veil rent revealed horizons yet uncharted, life's portrait, ever repainted in the light of relentless inquiry. And so the curtain falls on the portrait of the dead grandmother, yet the stage lights linger, awaiting the next player's cue in the grand, unending drama of deduction. Months slipped by in the inexorable procession that is London life, the autumn fogs yielding to winter's crystalline bite, then to spring's tentative thaw, as if the city itself sought to purge the year's accumulated grime. Baker Street resumed its rhythms under Mrs. Hudson's vigilant eye, the violin keening through the small hours, the Persian slipper yielding its tobacco hoard, the occasional telegram from Lestrade summoning us to fresher fray. The Hargrove affair, that intricate mosaic of pigment and poison, faded from the headlines like ink under rain, supplanted by cabinet scandals and colonial squabbles. Yet in my notebooks it endured, a case emblematic of Holmes's method, where the spectral yielded to the scrupulous, the posthumous portrait proving no more ghostly than a palimpsest awaiting the proper light. It was in the latter days of May, when the chestnuts in the row were ablaze with blossom and the air hummed with the promise of summer, that the final thread of that tangled skein presented itself. I had returned from my rounds, a bout of influenza, claiming half my Kensington patients, to find Holmes in rare repose, not with syringe in hand, but perusing the Times auction listings over a breakfast of kedgeree scarcely touched. His dressing gown hung loose, the morning sun slanting through the half-drawn blinds to gild the chaos of his chemical bench, where vials of cochineal extract still lingered from some tangential experiment. "Ah, Watson," he greeted, folding the paper with a snap that bespoke suppressed animation, "your timing is impeccable. The post has brought vindication, or irony depending on one's lens. Percival Hargrove's missive enclosing this." He slid an envelope across the table, its wax seal bearing the fox-head crest, now emblem of resilience rather than ruse. I broke it open, extracting a single sheet of Hargrove vellum, alongside a small parcel wrapped in tissue. "My dear Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, the audit concludes as summer dawns, the collections laid bare under experts from the Victoria and Albert, flawed yet fascinating. The chalice shards, as foretold, masked a twin, true Murano, hidden in the attics by Reginald's hand, its provenance impeccable, save for the secrecy that shrouded it. The false one? A masterful counterfeit, the Ellises' last labor before fate or mercy claimed them. No fever's accident, your deductions whisper. A dose of arsenic in their porter, administered by Reginald's own hand to silence the secret forever. Wilkins confessed it in his dotage, the Crimea oath binding him till now. The Codex, amended thus, tells the fuller tale. Mercy's mask over murder's blade. The heir elevated not from pauper's pity, but to bury a collector's crime. Enclosed, a token, the restored miniature from Lydia's locket, reframed in silver from the attic's trove. A portrait of truth's innocent, Percival Ellis Hargrove, blood of artisans turned avengers in glass. The hall thrives. Probate past unclouded, the scandals spun into scholarly tomes. Crow engraves the varnish's verse for the Academy. Lestrade toast your name at the yard. We are eternally your debtors. Percival Hargrove. I unwrapped the parcel, revealing the locket's miniature, the cherubic babe Percival in swaddling, his eyes already sharp with the lineage's cunning, Ellis ingenuity worthing will. The frame gleamed unmarred, a silver echo of the foxpin's gleam. Reginald a murderer. Then, I mused, passing the miniature to Holmes, who examined it under his lens with the detachment of a gemologist assaying a flawed diamond. The Ellises' fever, a mercy killing to protect the collection's veil, and Wilkins, loyal sentinel to the last, guarding the grave's whisper. It fits, the Codex's deeper bleed, the shipment's shadows. Yet another layer peeled, and still the core eludes. Why forge at all? Avarice, or the collector's compulsion to possess the impossible? Holmes set the lens aside, his long fingers tracing the miniature's edge, his expression a blend of satisfaction and that eternal ennui which idleness alone could provoke. The why, Watson, is the eternal quarry, the human heart's alchemy, transmuting greed to grandeur, mercy to malice. Reginald forged not for gold, but for the gleam. The chalice's illusion palmed on the Duke, a triumph of craft over coin. The Ellises knew, their silence bought with life, their heir co-opted as capstone. Finch perpetuated it for fees. Eleanor sought to shatter it for sanctity. And Percival? He inherits the truth, and in embracing it, the audit, the engravings, forges a new Hargrove untainted. He rose then, crossing to the window to fling wide the sash, admitting the rose-verdant bustle, riders cantering, nursemaids wheeling perambulators under the chestnut's canopy. The air, laced with horseflesh and fresh-turned earth, chased the room's lingering staleness, and Holmes inhaled deeply, his frame silhouetted against the blue. Observe the rider there, the colonel on the bay, his crop tucked under the arm rather than flourished. A man chastened by Crimea, perhaps, like our Wilkins, oaths unbroken, yet bent by time's inexorable forge. The case teaches, Watson, every portrait bears its shadow script, every chalice its flaw. We illuminate. The rest is varnish. I joined him at the sill, the miniature warm in my palm, and watched the tableau unfold, the city's ceaseless pageant, oblivious to the dramas beneath its skin. Mrs. Hudson bustled below with a basket of provisions, her glance upward a maternal query, and I waved assurance. Holmes, for his part, turned from the view with that abrupt finality, striding to his violin and drawing the bow in a languid arc, a slow air, mournful yet resolute, weaving through the open window to mingle with the birdsong. The notes cascaded, a coda to the Hargrove Symphony, accusation resolved in ash and audit, deception dissolved in dawn's unsparing light. Percival's heirship secured not by ink's deceit, but by the unvarnished ledger of legacy. Bloodlines blended, forgeries forgiven in the forge of frankness. Lydia's garnets would grace a wedding, perhaps, to some steady solicitor, untainted by ledgers. Crow's engravings would immortalize the varnish's verse, a cautionary etching for the Academy's halls. And Finch? His trial loomed in the autumn assizes, a spectacle of precedents overturned, his avarice the scaffold for justice's gavel. As the violin's strains faded, Holmes lowered the instrument, his eyes meeting mine with that rare glint of camaraderie. The game, my dear Watson, is never won, merely adjourned. But in this interlude, let us toast the dead grandmother's portrait, not in canvas, but in the truths it unveiled. Two gleams unfalse and shadows banished. I raised an imaginary glass, the admiration eternal, and in that moment, Baker Street seemed the axis of the world, its fogs the veil, its lights the rake, Holmes the unerring hand that parted one from the other. The annals close on this chapter, yet the book endures, its pages ever turning toward the next inscrutable script,